trying to roll that back in order to then, goose the profits of oil companies is going to have exactly the opposite effect.
A terminal user named Adam asks, having listened to Donald Trump in Savannah, so is the economic policy going to be inflation? And I wonder if we can ask the same question to Kamala Harris. Neither have fleshed out how they're going to pay for all of these ideas. You can talk about who would be more inflationary than the other, but is that the world we're in?
So the Harris plan actually has been evaluated by Moody's Analytics, and they find that it will increase GDP, not bring on inflation, keep the labor market strong. And, part of that is the tax policy side of things, that the Harris campaign has largely adopted the tax policies of the Biden budgets, which are a pretty balanced approach to trying to return to some level of revenue that can sustainably fund a modern government. And it's, mostly through increases on taxes on the very wealthiest and undoing some of the corporate tax cuts from the Trump administration.
So as we heard Donald Trump say, tax policy is one part of it. The other policy is effectively a tax on importers, I guess, although he may argue that it's actually a tax on the countries that are exporting, but tariffs specifically. Kamala Harris has painted his tariff proposals as a sales tax on the American consumer. He's obviously talking about some pretty high levels here. We heard him in his remarks just moments ago talk about 100% tariffs on all cars coming out of Mexico. He floated 200% on deer products made in Mexico yesterday. Is there a set tariff level, knowing that this administration has left intact many of the tariffs on Chinese goods specifically that went in place during the first Trump administration? Is there a level that is in fact not inflationary, that doesn't necessarily have to have negative consequences at home and in the result of passing on those costs to American consumers?
So I think this is another place where it's not just a tariff is a tariff is a tariff, right? The tariffs that the Biden administration has left in place, or in some sectors of the economy put in place, are largely very strategic. They are complements to other kinds of industrial policy that are designed to re-onshore supply chains for really critical inputs. Take the Chips and Science Act, and thinking about how to make sure that we can build a robust battery manufacturing sector as we do transition to a clean energy economy, and how we think about getting the most electric vehicles on the road as we can, while also avoiding a situation where we have no capacity to build those electric vehicles here in the United States. Those are places where, as part of a larger policy, tariffs can make a lot of sense. Putting massive across-the-board tariffs on everything that flows across the border is going to increase prices for American consumers. It's also going to increase prices for American manufacturers who want to use inputs from other countries to build things that they will then sell in the United States, including manufacturers that might want to relocate to the United States to be closer to customers and employ U.S. workers to do final builds, but might not want to do that if they're going to have to pay a massive tariff on all of their intermediate inputs before they come into the country. So I think it's silly to think that these tariffs will have the kinds of effects that Donald Trump is claiming. And again, I feel like we spend a lot of time rebutting wild claims made by Donald Trump. And just like I spent a lot of time in 2017 talking about how corporate tax cuts were not going to raise worker wages by $4,000. And these claims are the same as those claims, just with a slightly different flavor.
All right, Kitty, great to have you here in our Washington, D.C. studio. That's Kitty Richards, Senior Strategic Advisor at the Groundwork Collaborative and former Economic Policy Advisor to then Vice President Joe Biden. Great to have you. And of course, as we consider Donald Trump's remarks in Georgia today, he has just said once again that he will put into place, or he wants to at least, Congress probably is going to have some say in this, a 15% made in America tax rate for corporations.
That is a reminder for the policy proposals we're hearing from both campaigns, right? You're going to need Congress at some point, maybe not so much on the tariffs, but you better believe it on renegotiating the tax code, which is basically what we're talking about here.
Exactly. So as we consider the politics, not just of the presidential race, but the congressional ones that could ultimately decide what way policy goes, we reassemble our political panel. Jeannie Shanzano, Senior Democracy Fellow with the Center of the Study of the Presidency and Congress, and Rick Davis, Stone Court Capital Partner, both of them Bloomberg Politics contributors. So Rick, I'll come to you first, as we obviously just heard a more liberal point of view in terms of the kind of policies Donald Trump is putting forward. Is there not a base of voters who care about manufacturing jobs, whether they're in Georgia or the rest of the Rust Belt, who will like these words from Donald Trump, whether or not Wall Street economists will tell you that they're actually going to have the same impact in reality as he is suggesting?
Yeah, I think they'll hear more from Donald Trump than they will from the economists, and so more likely to believe the optimistic nature of his approach and sort of, the world's going to be so much better if I can just, create all these tariffs and all these taxes in the right place. The problem is there is enough history with tariffs that it's, a flashing red light, not yellow, red light, that I think is going to really complicate Trump's message. I mean, there's never been a scenario where massive trade war with the rest of the world, which is what he's basically describing, is somehow going to not result in slowing down the economy, real pressure on wages in domestic U.S., retaliatory tariffs and embargoes against us from our best trading partners, and destabilizing a geopolitical situation. Those big things aren't going to be ignored by the same voters that he's pitching today.
Interesting. Jeannie, we're going to hear from Kamala Harris tomorrow, who's going to try to contrast her economic vision from Donald Trump's here. Advisors telling Bloomberg here, in particular, they're looking at tax benefits to boost advanced domestic manufacturing, such as biotech, shipbuilding, semiconductors, data centers, forms of clean energy production beyond the incentives in the Inflation Reduction Act. Does she have an audience for that? Are voters reading enough, caring enough to tell the difference?
Yeah, I think she does have an audience. I think the reality is the reason we're hearing from both campaigns in these blue wall states in particular about the economy and manufacturing specifically is because it matters to voters that they need to reach, particularly those who tell us they haven't made up their minds and yet may still vote. And so that's why we're hearing more detailed proposals. I have to say I was very happy to hear Donald Trump speaking about manufacturing, because what it reinforced was that he doesn't really have anything new to offer. He is talking about increasing tariffs and he is talking about decreasing taxes. And we know the impact of increasing tariffs. We have decades and decades of research to look and to see how that goes. We also know what happened in 2017 with his tax cuts and this idea they were going to trickle down. That didn't come to fruition. And so voters in Pennsylvania and these other states have now the opportunity to say, do we want to go back to that? Is this going to help us? I will say he didn't talk about it now, or today, at least as far as I heard, but he may, is where he is on more solid ground is in terms of regulation. I think many of us agree we need to reform the regulatory structure in this country. That is absolutely true. We regulate far too much. We need maybe not deregulation, but maybe reformed regulation. But these other ideas are not at all fulfilling from the prescription of driving us forward in a positive way, at least as far as I heard, as it pertains to manufacturing. So I think voters are going to either ask for more or be looking in another direction when they come out of this kind of speech.
Well, Rick, finally, we just have about a minute left. But if the goal is really to reach these key groups of voters and they want to actually make their policy views known, is it not more effective forum not doing a speech that may get some degree of coverage depending on what network or outlook you're talking about versus, say, just doing another debate in late October closer to the election? Is that the biggest platform they could possibly want to deliver these ideas?
Well, I think the biggest platform would be a good debate on Bloomberg so that we could have an intelligent conversation about the economic realities of the world. But outside of that, I would say from a campaign perspective, dominating the state media in Georgia for one day is actually a pretty good idea. And The things I couldn't understand is last week trying to dominate the media in Long Island, New York, which didn't make any sense whatsoever. So there's a little bit of confusion in the sort of traditional political strategy. But I think what you'll see from these two campaigns is regular appearances every single day between now and the end of the election in a targeted state, making some kind of a policy prescription that is particular, like this one, to the state, like in Savannah, talking about the port.
Rick Davis, Jeannie Shen Zeno, great conversation. Our signature panel on the heels of Donald Trump's economic address today. As we mentioned, we'll bring you Kamala Harris's speech tomorrow from Pittsburgh. With Kaylee Lyons in Washington, I'm Joe Matthew. Thanks for being with us. This is Bloomberg.
1:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long. Here at Bloomberg, we have got the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ, all in the green. Any advance today for both the Dow and the S&P will be another record. Right now, we have got the S&P up 11, a gain of 0.2%. Right now, the S&P is trading at 57.29. The Dow swinging between gains and losses, down now by 1 point. Key takeaway there, little change. We have got NASDAQ up 102, up by about 0.6%, helping lead today's advance. NVIDIA up now by 4.5%. Bottom line, stocks drifting higher, erasing earlier losses. Meta platform investors will be gathering tomorrow for an event where they will be getting insights into where the stock's record-breaking rally is heading next. Meta's annual Connect conference will kick off tomorrow. Meta platform shares down now by 0.4%. 10-year 3.74%, the 2-year 3.55%. Spot gold is surging 0.9% right now, up by about $23 the ounce to $26.51. Also getting a lift today, West Texas Intermediate crude oil trading higher now by 1.5%, $71.42 a barrel. So again, recapping, S&P trading right around a record, up by another 0.2%. Balance of power continues now. Back we go to Washington, and once again, your hosts, Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lyons.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you so much. With the up-to-date trades we're seeing in financial markets today. Meanwhile, an up-to-date headline just crossing the Bloomberg terminal as we still have former President Donald Trump delivering a speech on the economy and manufacturing in Savannah, Georgia. A new idea now has been put forward by Trump, suggesting he will create special zones for federal land with low taxes and regulations specifically for American producers. This is, of course, one of his ideas to incentivize more manufacturing and production in America. He says that these will be ideal spots for relocating entire industries that we've taken in from other countries. This is, of course, Joe, on top of his other suggestions, including a 15% made in America corporate tax rate, so a lower rate for companies that are creating their products in the U.S.
Yeah, laying out the pitch today to foreign companies to essentially relocate their business here in the U.S. The question we had earlier for Michael Whatley, the chair of the RNC, is whether they would be spared the tariffs that Donald Trump is also talking about. I presume the answer would be yes, otherwise there wouldn't be much motivation to do this. But the punitive side of this is real, too. He's talking about a 200% tariff on John Deere if they move to Mexico. And it's not the whole company. It would be a portion of the manufacturing process, which got a massive round of applause in Savannah today.
Well, and he also suggested during the course of this speech thus far, 100% tariff on every single car coming across the Mexican border. He, of course, has suggested that before. Yeah. He has, though, maintained, as he did once again just about half an hour ago, that while this will bring in hundreds of billions of dollars into the U.S. Treasury's accounts, it will not cause inflation. That, of course, is something disputed by many economists, and it also comes at a time where there's still many inflationary risks that could be lingering out there in the global economy. Specifically, when we think about energy, he's talking about lowering energy costs by unleashing more American production, but production in the Middle East is very much in question as we're seeing escalating conflict.
That's true.
There.
And it's been interesting to watch the market weather the storm on this, considering what we're talking about, a wider war, a regional conflict. Prices of crude oil have been fairly well restrained. We've seen a bit of an uptick recently here, but the fact is people in many cases are paying less than $3 a gallon for gas in this country right now, Kaylee. Joe Biden, of course, talked at the United Nations General Assembly about the situation, not only in the Middle East, Kaylee, but the dangerous world that surrounds us. This is his last address before UNGA. Let's get a taste of what the president said.
Many look at the world today and see difficulties and react with despair. But I do not. I won't. As leaders, we don't have the luxury. I recognize the challenges from Ukraine to Gaza to Sudan and beyond. War, hunger, terrorism, brutality, record displacement of people, the climate crisis, democracy at risk.
Let's bring in Michael Allen, Managing Director of Beacon Global Strategies, former Special Assistant to President George W. Bush in the national security sector. Always great to see you, Michael. Thanks for joining us today at the table.
Thank you.
Of course, the situation in Israel with Gaza, now as well with Hezbollah and Lebanon, is a major story here at this United Nations assembly, the president referring to Gaza there in that address that we heard. We've been in touch with you since October 7th, and we've seen the temperature rise consistently since then. And as Israel looks to the north now, there are questions about whether this is a war, if we can call it that, with Hezbollah, or whether this could escalate more. What do you think?
I think it's slowly and steadily escalating into something like a war. The question will be ultimately, does it turn into a ground war? But when you line up all the things that have happened in recent weeks, from the commando raid to blow up a drone factory embedded in a mountain in Syria, which Hezbollah operated, plus you take the pager attacks, the walkie-talkie attacks, the essentially decapitation of the Radwan force, and now more aggressive bombing across Lebanon in order to take out the very rockets and missiles that Hezbollah likes to aim at Israel. I think this is all gearing up for something much more substantial than we're seeing now.
Well, and then if that is the case, where do we cross the line to a more substantive conflict? How do we know when it's time to call it a war?
Well, it's probably, in my estimation, already very close to being a war. There's certainly trading blows left and right. But if there's a tank raid into Lebanon, I think that will be a new significant moment. They, of course, did that in 1982 and again in 2006 without great results. But if you want to be optimistic about it, this is Israel trying to create new facts on the ground so that maybe diplomacy would work, that they would implement the old United Nations Security Council resolution from 2006 and get Hezbollah pushed back northwards so that they can't range their rockets into northern Israel. Or this is just a more extreme, more aggressive version of what we hear the Israelis are up to about mowing the grass. Here, I think it's more root and branch destruction of Hezbollah, because after October 7th, I don't think they can continue to live with another genocidal terrorist organization on one of their borders.
Root and branch. All the while, the U.S. is arming up in the region, sending additional troops, we're told, with the idea, you mentioned ground war in our minds. What exactly are we prepared to do?
So we certainly would not go in on the ground, and the Israelis are proud of the fact that they don't want U.S. assistance.
They wouldn't make that ask.
They wouldn't make that ask of us. If we have more troops in the region, I think they're largely talking about gray-hulled naval ships. Maybe there's some military advisors in Israel proper to help with the command and control if there were another, like in April, attack by Iran. But by and large, I think the U.S. is trying to keep its involvement as low as possible.
F-22s we parked there, though, are for a real reason. We saw them employed in that attack from Iran.
To take out drones from Iran, cruise missiles and the rest. And also it has a big deterrent value. I mean, the real question is, what's Iran going to do next? Does Iran feel like, my God, our most prized proxy, the all-powerful Hezbollah, which we use as a deterrent against Israel attacking Iran's nuclear program, does Iran say, I can't stomach the complete degradation of this force and I have to do something? But what?
Well, I guess the question that then follows is, how much say does Iran really have in the actions of Hezbollah? If Hezbollah feels it needs to retaliate for these various attacks conducted by Israel, would they do that without the go-ahead from Tehran?
I think they're definitely in consultation. They're very, very tight. Nasrallah, who is the head of Hezbollah, is always, I'm told, very close with the supreme leader. So they're at a minimum coordinating very closely. I think Iran knows that Hezbollah's got to hit back somehow, but I think they're probably on pins and needles trying to figure out, does Iran get involved in this? How do I keep Hezbollah in the fight? How do I put pressure on Israel in another front or in another theater so that maybe they have to pull back on Lebanon?
From UNGA today in New York, NBC News reporting the Iranian president says he does not want war with Israel. You believe him?
I do. I don't think it's really in his interest, because he would lose in a conventional war.
That's a mutual interest, right?
I think it is.
Yet we're still marching down this road together.
Yeah, I think that Israel doesn't want war per se. Everyone wants to take care of the nuclear program if they can, if that's even militarily possible at this point. And certainly Iran wants to continue using their proxies because they're getting the best of both worlds. They have terrorist organizations that hit Israel all the time, And while there are sanctions up against them, they're not always enforced, and they would lose a conventional exchange with Israel.
Israel has maintained that its goal here is just for Israelis to be able to return to their homes in the north. Hezbollah has said, if you want to be able to do that, just end the war in Gaza, and then the conflict between the two of us will stop. Is that not the solution here? Is there's a push still by the Biden administration to reach a ceasefire deal? Why not focus the energy and effort on that versus this action across the northern border?
So they're definitely linked. Hezbollah says we're going to keep sending rockets your way until the Gaza ceasefire occurs. But I think even, and we've seen reports of this that I know you've seen, that the United States has more or less given up on the prospects of a ceasefire
Certainly
in
not
Gaza.
as openly optimistic.
They're not optimistic at all, and I don't blame them whatsoever. First of all, we don't know if Sinwar's dead. He might be dead. That's what some press reports have indicated of late. They're trying to figure that out. But also, just as Gaza has slowed down because there are fewer targets, Israel feels freer to go northward.
So are we then giving up on the hostages?
I hate to say it like that, but I don't ever really think Netanyahu had it at the very top of his list. I feel like after October 7th, he felt like he needed to increase deterrence and increase the security of Israel in the region. But it looks increasingly unlikely that there is going to be a deal in the offing. But
based on what we've seen from the IDF, there would have to be a deal, right? These rescue operations have been largely unsuccessful.
They've been largely unsuccessful. There's too many miles of tunnels in Gaza. Now, listen, if Sinwar is killed, there are reports that the other people around him are not quite as hardcore as he was. So it's not inconceivable that some hostages could come out if there was some sort of deal. But let's see if Sinwar pokes his head back up sometime soon.
So obviously this is one active area of conflict that is dominating conversation at the United Nations, but it is unfortunately not the only one. The war in Ukraine is also on the agenda, and that was the focus of many of President Biden's remarks before the General Assembly today. This idea that alliances supporting Ukraine need to stick together. The Associated Press is now reporting that the U.S. on Wednesday, so tomorrow, will be announcing a new aid package, $375 million in military aid to Ukraine. But we also understand, Michael, that on Thursday, Zelensky, when he meets with Biden at the White House, is going to be pushing a plan to end the war with Russia. Do you think it's realistically time for those conversations, or is the aid going to have to keep flowing for quite some time?
Well, the aid has got to keep flowing. The Ukrainians are honestly on their back foot. For the first time, it looks like they're losing more than incremental amounts of territory. But I like this Zelensky initiative. It's because there's an election coming. It's because Donald Trump and J.D. Vance say that they are either going to, in Vance's mind, do nothing for Ukraine, or in Trump's mind, immediately try and settle the conflict. I think this is Zelensky's way of saying, I hear you, President Trump. I hear you, Vice President Harris. I understand the politics is changing in the United States. But here's what we think should be a reasonable resolution to this conflict. And I think it's fine, because you can't beat something with nothing. He's got to come to something to the table.
Yeah. What is Volodymyr Zelensky's conversation with Donald Trump like? Donald Trump wouldn't even say in the debate that he wanted Ukraine to win the war.
Yeah.
To be a fly on the wall, considering the history that these two have had. What's Donald Trump's message to Zelensky?
I think Trump will say to Zelensky, we have to wrap this up soon. Yeah. If you see anything from Trump, I do believe it's a sincere belief, born from stress about endless wars, that he wants the fighting to stop in the Middle East and definitely in Ukraine. I think Zelensky,
you got to give up the Donbass or something.
I think Zelensky has to say, if you want a lasting peace and you want to be credited for that, I need more time and I need more military and economic assistance to condition Vladimir Putin to where he might agree to a ceasefire. If you do it along the lines as they exist today, that's trouble and a recipe for Russia to come back into Ukraine in a situation where Ukraine feels insecure.
All right, Michael Allen, always great to have you here in our Washington, D.C. studio. He, of course, is Managing Director of Beacon Global Strategies, former Special Assistant to President George W. Bush in national security, here with us on Bloomberg TV and radio. And, of course, as Michael helps us analyze some of the commentary we're getting out of the UN, specifically what we've already heard from President Biden in his first speech of the day, we will be hearing another speech from Biden later on today, 4:45 p.m. Eastern time, roughly when it's scheduled, at an event Bloomberg is hosting in New York.
That's right. Just might coincide with the late edition of Balance of Power. So maybe we'll bump into each other here with the president while we're at it, making his way through New York. To that end, 5 p.m. Eastern time, Balance of Power here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Kaylee Limes will be here. So will I, as we flesh out the economic proposals from both presidential campaigns. Kaylee, we'll hear from Kamala Harris tomorrow.
Indeed, we will. And before that, you're about to hear from Bloomberg Business Week. That's straight ahead on Bloomberg TV and radio.
is Bloomberg Business Week. Insight from the reporters and editors who bring you America's most trusted business magazine, plus global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Messer and Tim Stenevec on Bloomberg Radio.
very good afternoon, everybody. You are listening and watching Bloomberg Business Week. Carol Massar along with Stephen Carroll, who is in for Tim. And no, we're not at Bloomberg headquarters. No, it's a special day today.
You've taken me on a day trip.
I have taken you. I've been whisking you around New York City, just cross town from our headquarters. It's a big day, the Earthshot Innovation Prize Summit. That is happening as we speak. And then in just about an hour, hour and a half, we're going to get the Bloomberg Global Business Forum underway. It's all about talking some of the big issues that are facing global leaders, but the public and private sectors and the Earthshot Prize Innovation Summit, specifically entrepreneurs, innovators figuring out how to tackle climate change.
People with ideas of the future who are going to be some of the leading lights of the future as well will go now forward to the announcement of the Earthshot Prize going to take place in Cape Town. So those finalists will be narrowed down to 5 winners for that prize as well. So that is something that we'll be talking about a little bit later in the show. We'll have Jennifer Zabasaj, our Chief Africa Correspondent, taking us through some of those finalists who she's been speaking to here at the Plaza Hotel in New York.
It's really fascinating, and Bloomberg Philanthropy is very involved in that and sponsoring that. In terms of conversations, we're going to be talking a lot about climate change today, but we're also going to be talking about the global economy, what's needed, what's going on, and we have a very special guest on that, the IMF Managing Director, Kristalina Georgieva. And we, I have to say, in putting this together, prepping, we feel like we have an hour's worth of questions.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's state of the global economy. We're into the central bank easing cycle kicked off by the Fed, joining the other central banks that are easing as well. What does that mean for the future of the economy as well? And of course, what does that mean for climate finance, and an issue that Kristalina Georgieva also very involved with at the IMF too. Other great conversations coming up for you as well. We're going to be speaking to the CFTC chair, Rustine Benham as well.
Crypto might come up
regulation.
A little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. Carbon finance as well, very interesting there too. That's another key conversation we have for you today.
Election futures, or betting on the election, might we talk about that as well. And then we have also the Whole Foods CEO. Last time we talked with him was at the Milken Institute on the West Coast, Jason Beekle. What's interesting is we talk a lot about the cost of groceries. Obviously, Whole Foods kind of in a different economic strata, but I am curious if they are increasingly seeing consumers trade down. So we'll talk about that. But the food industry is so important when it comes to the green space, right, in terms of food sustainability. So we're going to talk with him about that as well.
First up, though, we're going to get a check on the latest market-moving news and some breaking news on Visa with Charlie Pellet. Charlie.
Indeed, I thank you very much, Stephen and Carol. The U.S. Justice Department suing Visa over an antitrust matter. This according to a filing in federal court in Manhattan. Visa shares on that report down now by 4.4%. We do have MasterCard moving lower as well. MasterCard down now by 2.4%. U.S. antitrust enforcers have been preparing a case accusing Visa of taking steps to keep rivals from challenging its dominance in the debit card market. This according to sources who spoke with Bloomberg. So again, key headline, key takeaway here, Visa lower as the U.S. Justice Department sues Visa over an antitrust matter. We've got U.S. stocks trading higher right now with the S&P 500 index on track for a record, up now by about 0.2%, up 9 points. The Dow, little change, swinging between gains and losses now, up by 1 point. NASDAQ up 96, a gain there of 0.5%. 10-year yield 3.74%, with the 2-year 3.55%. Spot gold up $26 the ounce. That is an advance right now of 1% to $26.54. And West Texas Intermediate crude up 1.3%, $71.30 for a barrel of WTI. Bottom line right now, stocks advancing on track potentially for another record on the S&P. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Charlie Pellet, and that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, thank you so much. I'm Carol Massar along with Stephen Carroll here at the Plaza Hotel in New York City. And we mentioned just a moment ago about one of the events happening right now is the Earthshot Prize Innovation Summit. And what this is tapping into entrepreneurs around the globe who are seeing the stresses caused by climate change front and center. And they are coming up with some unique solutions, and the prize recognizes them and helps them in that process.
Yeah, look, it's an absolutely fascinating process and has really highlighted over the history of the prize some incredible companies as well. We'll get into that in a moment. Before we get to the solutions, we want to tackle, first of all, some of the problems outlined in today's big take from Bloomberg as well. Just really setting the scene for us as to why we need these Earthshot innovators. The story looking at how the issue of fires is even spreading as far as the Arctic.
So let's get to it, because it is among the most read stories on the Bloomberg. Kyle Kim is with us, Bloomberg News data visualization reporter, back at our Bloomberg headquarters studio in New York City. Hey, Kyle, great to have you here with Stephen and myself. As we said, you have to understand the problem. I think many of us can say we do understand it increasingly, unfortunately, because we see it often on a daily basis. The wildfires. Talk about that specifically. We've reported on it a lot, but there's a particular kind of wildfire that makes it even more stressful. What's going on?
Yeah, so most people probably understand wildfires by now, especially with climate change changing the intensity and how common it's getting. But one of those things that is becoming more and more common are fires that you wouldn't really expect in places as cold as the Arctic and subarctic and elsewhere, like the wetlands of Brazil and Indonesia. And those first two places, the Arctic and Brazil, are having a particularly bad fire season this year. And part of our story dives into that and visualizes where those fires are occurring.
One of the really interesting things in reading this story as well is that how the fires are identified, because often they're below the surface and there's a smell that these fires produce. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, so, oftentimes these fires are underground, like I said, and they're burning these carbon-rich soils in layers like permafrost and peat. And, contrasting to typically, fires above ground are burning through forests and grasslands, and they can smolder below the surface for months and just burn and release an enormous amount of carbon.
I thought what was interesting, too, as so often happens in a Bloomberg Big Take, you're part of the data visualization team, and I highly recommend that everybody go online and check it out, because there is an interactive component to it. But you do get into, certainly, the maps and what we are seeing. Tell us about that piece of the story, and in terms of telling it and showing the frequency of it and how widespread it is globally.
Yeah, I mean, just thinking about the Northern Hemisphere, in the higher latitudes of North America, New Yorkers probably remember all of that smoke that blew down from Canada last year, and this year's fire in Western Canada reached all the way to Western Europe, which is quite far, if you think about. And the fire season for this year has become one of the worst in terms of carbon emissions for Canada, and there were parts of eastern Russia this year that also had wildfire hotspots above the Arctic Circle. So, with permafrost expected to disappear up to a third in the next 50 years, it's only expected to get worse over the time.
And it's not just the Arctic that you're tackling in this story as well. There's also an element focusing on an area of wetlands in Brazil, also very key for the local ecosystem, of course, but also for the broader environment. What sort of impact are we seeing fires have there?
Yeah, the Pantanal in South America, it's the world's largest tropical wetland, and so it has a lot of rich biodiversity, and it's also experiencing some of its worst fires. And so far this year, more than 1 million acres burned since the start of the summer. And the impact, technically fire season is still ongoing, so we don't really know the full impact in that region, but we know about 17 million animals were killed from their last major fire, which was in fire season, which was in 2020.
Kyle, one of the things I want to, and you've touched on this, is that, we talk about the fires a lot. We talk about some of the different things that are going on with climate change generally around the globe. But why do these fires specifically, I think in the story it's noted, it's a double whammy for global warming. How does it kind of exacerbate the situation? Yeah,
well, for one, it's a bit harder to tackle for people on the front line. It's the firefighters who have to, all of these fires that are happening underground, they have to look for smoke coming from the ground, and so it just makes locating it even harder, and having to dig holes essentially and inject water into the ground is just hard. It's just a lot harder to fight. In terms of the climate implications, it's burning a lot of carbon-rich soil that takes, think of the Arctic and the tundra, which is essentially a freezer in the ground that has been holding thousands of years of organic material. And so as the climate's warming and as carbon emissions from this type of fire is going to increase over time, there's a huge implication for how the rest of the world is going to feel the ramifications of this.
Kyle, it's a great piece, and I think that the graphics really do illustrate the scale of what we're dealing with. We're, of course, talking about Climate Week here in New York as well. I wonder, in your researching for this story, what's the one thing that you'd want people to take away from this issue that they may not have known anything about?
I think, I think a lot of people understand climate change now and have, read various stories about climate change over the years, but it's interesting to see how it's really kind of morphing into reality, and the changing behavior of fires and how wildfires are happening is a little bit frightening to read more about and understand, and just understanding how it's only going to get worse. I think the nature of this is still understudied, and so there's still a lot to learn about how to address this issue on a wide scale. I think for one, just better monitoring carbon emissions and how the impacts of the emissions from these kinds of fires are going to impact both local communities and the broader scope of the region is going to be something that we should focus on.
Well, that certainly understanding the problem, what we're dealing with, is certainly step one in a big way. Kyle Kim, thank you so much. Data visualization reporter at Bloomberg News, back in our studio at Bloomberg headquarters here in New York City. All right, so that's the big take, kind of laying out the problem. Yeah. Now we want to get to something that is certainly what the Earthshot Prize is all about, and that is looking at the innovations, the entrepreneurs that are trying to tackle the problem around the world. And that brings us to a Bloomberg colleague.
Yes, Jennifer Zabasajja is with us, our Chief Africa Correspondent, host of Africa Amplified on Bloomberg Television. Jan, great to see you here. Now, of course, you've been speaking to the finalists that we learned the identities and the names of their companies about earlier here today at the Plaza Hotel. I want to kind of give our viewers and listeners an idea of what sort of companies they're focusing on. Give us a few highlights of some of those finalists.
It's fascinating, Stephen and Carol. Thank you so much for having me. I mean, I was speaking with all 14 of them, and it runs the gamut of the types of solutions that they're trying to come up with. And you talk about different places in the world where they're trying to tackle. So one, very fascinating, you don't think about it, food wastage, of course, is a big issue. In Kenya, I actually met one entrepreneur who is trying to use cooling as a service. So he has developed refrigerators which are meant to help in the last mile, right, of getting a lot of these food to people. There's also...
So it's not wasted. It's as simple as that, right? Refrigeration.
Exactly. But you can't imagine how much food gets wasted, especially in those parts of the world, right? And there's also, I met another entrepreneur who was talking to us about how he's trying to make petrochemical-free products, and he actually had some props on set that he was showing us. He had a bag that he had made petrochemical-free, and also a shirt. Another issue that we don't always think about, but they're trying to tap into a lot of the causes and the reasons why we're seeing a lot of the degradation of the world and of the climate solutions that they're trying to tackle. There is also a power generation system that captures wasted heat, so a lot of waste-related solutions that they're coming up with. But it was fascinating because many of these folks were just saying, this started out as an idea for them, right? They're looking at a lot of the issues that are global, causing a lot of despair, and seeing what they can do about it.
It always amazes me and floors me and just drags me in terms of, the emerging economies, right? There are just problems that are so front and center, right? Things that we often take in the developed world for granted. And they're like, okay, we have a problem, and let's figure out a fix. And that's where these guys often get started.
Exactly. And they keep talking about just how important this community is for them, because it is one thing to have a problem and a solution and an idea. It's another thing to be able to have capital in order to address that, and also to be able to scale that. And that's really what they talk about, just the opportunity that the Earthshot Prize gives them to do that. But then also just amplify the messaging, Carol, as you're mentioning, because many people don't know just how much of a problem food waste or something is. for people. And so it just gives them another platform to hopefully be able to carry that and go that last mile for what they're trying to achieve.
It's such an incredible range of ideas, first of all, but also a global spread too. I mean, you know, I was looking at, you mentioned Delight in Kenya, two of the Kenyan businesses actually highlighted here as well, but also we've got, you know, candidates from Ecuador. I was looking at one from the UK about algae as well, which uses the wastewater from Scottish distilleries. Which, okay, fine, caught my interest, but that's about actually dealing with fish stocks. Like the range of solutions are huge, and the fact that we're looking at global solutions to global problems.
Right, and exactly, Stephen. I think it's important to point that out because there were thousands of nominees that were actually part of this. They came from all parts of the world, various continents. I think it was 6 that we were talking about earlier, and so there are a lot of other entrepreneurs out there who are trying to tackle this. But a lot of these folks have come together and said, it's not really about competition, it's about addressing these issues for our communities that are back home that are dealing with this. So how can we look to the things that we use every day, like algae, like seaweed, like, you know, refrigerators, and potentially come up with solutions?
I also think what's interesting about the Earthshot is that you often find that with these entrepreneurs, they're brought together and they're often in just having conversations with one another, like, oh, okay, wait, that's maybe a way, something I can address to what I'm doing.
Yes.
Like the collaboration aspect of it is also interesting.
Exactly, and Carol, we spoke to a few of the Earthshot graduates, right, from 2023.
How are they doing?
I know, it's a very surreal moment.
Because we're coming up on the 4th award ceremony, right?
Yeah. But for them, one of them was just telling me, you know, I remember being here. I remember feeling exactly how those finalists feel right now. And it's not the end of anything for them, right? It's just the beginning for a lot of them. And so we were on stage earlier talking to one of the winners who said this has helped him to be able to, again, scale up and amplify his messaging and his image. And he was sitting
It makes a difference, right?
And it makes a difference, yeah. And
you said he was sitting next to,
he was sitting next to a finalist who, again, in no way was competing because they have different solutions that they're offering. And so they're trying to all come up with some way to really address the climate issues that they are passionate about. And they call each other family, they call each other friends. One of them gave a tip saying that, you know, make sure to remember that you want to ask for things for people, but you also want to remember the people who you're on this journey with.
We have the finalists now. We're counting down to the prize ceremony, which is going to be in Cape Town, very close to where you're based, in South Africa as well. I mean, how important is it that that's happening in Cape Town? And talk us through the process that we get to the 6th of November.
Right. I think when we think about a lot of the solutions and the issues, I guess we should start there. Much of it is happening on the African continent, right? We were talking about earlier the issue of water, something that potentially we take for granted in the developed world. Right. One of the finalists was actually telling me there's more people with cell phones than with access to clean water, right? And so having the Earthshot final, the awards in South Africa, which is of course part of the just energy transition, they are of course though big producers of fossil fuels, and so they're dealing with their own issues in terms of climate change and transitions. I think it sends a message, right, that potentially the government is taking this seriously, but also I know the Earthshot team and also a lot of the climate activists have been working very closely, right? And so bringing that message home, making sure that it is about the financing and about including the people who are maybe the most affected by climate change into the conversation is very important.
What's your big takeaway? Just got about 30 seconds left.
Ooh, my big takeaway for the day?
When you talk with, especially when you talk with them. I always find them really inspiring.
That's my big takeaway. They're disruptors. They're optimistic.
Nice.
And I think, again, there's so many issues. They said there's a lot of despair. There's a lot of things to be sad about.
Right.
But there's so much more to be excited about if we all get on the same page. And that's something I think that can resonate with us all.
Jen, great to have you with us. Jennifer Zabasajja, Chief Africa Correspondent. Check out Jennifer's podcast, by the way, Next Africa as well. Well, with leading affiliates.
Great stuff. I agree. Always inspiring. Hey, coming up, we're going to talk a little bit more about food sustainability. We've got the Whole Foods CEO coming your way in just a moment. This is Bloomberg.
It's 2:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. The U.S. Justice Department is suing Visa over an antitrust matter. This according to a filing in federal court in Manhattan. Sources tell Bloomberg antitrust enforcers have been preparing a case accusing Visa of taking steps to keep rivals from challenging its dominance in the debit card market. Right now, we have got Visa shares trading lower. Visa down by 4.3%. Rival MasterCard also lower, down now by 2.3%. Stocks are drifting higher. We've got the S&P on track for another record, up 8 to 57.26, a gain of 0.1%. Dow Industrial is doing a whole lot of nothing, swinging between gains and losses. Right now, little changed, up by 1 point. NASDAQ, though, up 87, a gain there of 0.5%. 10-year at 3.72% with a 2-year 3.54%. Gold up 1%, 26.56 the ounce on the precious metal, while West Texas Intermediate crude oil is rallying 1.6% right now, 71.51 a barrel. So again, recapping, S&P up 8, a gain of 0.1%. For on-demand news, 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, thank you so much. Carol Master along with Stephen Carroll. We're live here at the Plaza at the Earthshot Prize Innovation Summit. And really great just talking with Jen in terms of the innovators for the Earthshot Prize, looking at things like food waste in particular. And the UN has some data about that.
Yeah, that's right. Look, this is something that they're stressing, that how we eat and how food is produced is going to be one of the key issues when it comes to tackling what's going on in the future of the climate as well. We're looking ahead towards the Global Business Forum taking place here in the Plaza as well. But we want to talk a little bit about the selling, the production of food and where the pressures come to that, and how we think about doing that more environmentally friendly as well. This in a day, we've also had Consumer Confidence Day out too.
Exactly, right? So we all tie it together with this next guest. Whole Foods Market CEO Jason Beekle is back with us. He's actually at Bloomberg headquarters in New York City, but the last time I spoke with him, Jason was back at Milken in May. Great to have you here with us. I do want to start with, though, the greening of all of the food that we eat, how it's produced, how it's sold. Talk to us about sustainability issues at Whole Foods, how that is front and center, or what you guys are doing to make it front and center.
Hi, Carol and Stephen. So happy to be here. One of the things I'm so proud of is going back 44 years ago when we opened our first store, climate-friendly agriculture practices like regenerative and organic have been at the heart of Whole Foods Market. And we've always looked at the environment as one of our core stakeholders, and we actually have a core value around it as well. So I'm so proud of the work that we continue to do to lead not only within our industry, but helping drive change across food systems around the world. You know, for us, we look at our food systems are, in jeopardy of being able to produce the products that we know and love today for our future generations. And so it's why we're trying to take big stakes in the ground and investing in areas like regenerative to help ensure that we can have the nutrient density and be able to continue to supply our customers with amazing products.
What are the benchmarks that you're looking at in this area? What are the metrics that, both your investors but also your customers are going to be looking at when it comes to making progress on those goals?
Well, one of the things that is great is we're part of Amazon, and as part of the climate pledge, we have direct goals that we are tied to help support those efforts. And for us, given the fact this has already been part of our culture and our DNA, it's actually been great to take the work that we already were doing and just clipping it into some more advanced goals to help advance the work that we're doing. One of those examples is reducing our food waste. We took a goal of reducing it by 50% by 2030. But I've been talking with our teams. We have to do better than that. The reality is we have too many people who are in need and don't have food access, and we have products that are going in landfills today. So we have to be able to help divert that food as well. And if we're not able to make sure that it's available for human consumption, let's get into programs where it can support animal feed or composting. So for us, it's not even just about the goals that we're setting, but it's how can we do it quicker, because we feel that burning platform in helping drive change.
Well, Jason, let me put that question to you because, it is certainly part of your DNA in terms of Whole Foods, thinking about sustainability, organic, regenerative. But having said that, how do we do it faster?
Yeah, well, I think one of the things we need to do is engage customers and ultimately make sure that they understand the choices that they're making at the shelf and how it's going to impact future generations. One of the things that I'm really optimistic about in this space is, looking at Gen Z. We've been doing some customer insight work in this space, and what's exciting is, 70% of Gen Zers say they support climate-friendly agriculture, and 55% of them are saying they'll actually pay a premium for that product. And, looking at customer insights before, there's a lot of times customers will say one thing, but they do something else. Even if a quarter of the folks actually respond accurately here, that's progress. And as we can work with more and more suppliers in finding ways to implement, regenerative and climate-smart agriculture practices, including organic, there's actually upside across the stream. The reality is that we can actually improve the margins for farmers. We can actually, take out costs across the supply chain systems, and at the same time, we can deliver a higher quality product that's actually better for the environment.
You've also been doing this, though, at a time when production costs are getting higher as well. And I wonder how much of a hit Whole Foods is having to take on trying to control costs for customers, and how much more. You say that customers are willing to pay more for sustainable food, but how much more?
Yeah, I think that it depends upon the product and the category. And one of the things we're really trying to do is make sure that we can serve customers across a very broad spectrum. You talked about some of the increasing costs that customers are seeing, and we know that customers have been pinched on inflation, not just in food, but across all their areas of spending. And so our focus in this calendar year has actually been bringing prices down. So we've invested over 25% of our items across an average store have seen a price reduction this year. 880 of those have been 365 items. So they've been at the opening price point, if you will, creating a great opportunity for value for customers without sacrificing quality. And at the same time, we've doubled the number of promotions from 2023 to 2024. And this allows us to, have a great offering where we have a good, better, best across, every aspect of our store. And so good can be the entry-level product where customers can find great value, great quality, and those who may want the best, something that is certified regenerative organic, of which we've got a lot of new offerings we've been bringing in under our Whole Foods Market label. And I'll tell you, these products, in some cases, we've had a challenge of not even having the supply based upon the demand. It's been great because customers who really align with that ethos and want to be able to support those efforts, we're able to provide those products as well. So having that broad spectrum where any customer can have accessibility to Whole Foods and have great quality product is one of our goals here. And at the same time, supporting the environment.
Hey, Jason, one thing we've got to ask you, U.S. consumer confidence unexpectedly falling the most in 3 years, concerns about the labor market. Having said that, I am a consumer who trades down. I'm okay if it's not the brand name right now. And I know you guys have a 365 brand name. What are you seeing with consumers? Are you seeing strains? And I know your consumer is a higher income consumer, but what are you seeing with consumers?
Yeah, it's a great question. And one of the things, sometimes folks think we have just a higher end consumer. The reality is we actually have a really broad spectrum of customers that we've been able to bring in. And a lot of that has to do with the work that we've done in helping lower prices and increase our promotions. And one of the opportunities that I think that we have in this space is make sure that customers have options. And one of the things that we've seen more recently is customers have leaned in areas like ground proteins. So you take ground beef, ground turkey, ground chicken, ground lamb. We've seen those items actually increase twofold compared to the rest of meat. But also, interestingly enough, is we're also seeing increases on the premium products as well. So some of our top cuts of steak. And part of that is, consumers are seeing increased prices at restaurants. And so just, our store here at Hudson Yards in Manhattan West, this week I was talking and, why they were seeing, such great increases in, some of their steaks. And they're like, customers are telling us that they can get this steak. It's as good, if not better quality, than they're going to go to a restaurant. And they're getting it for a quarter of the price. And so pair that with a great bottle of wine at half price, folks are able to sort of celebrate in-house and enjoying great food. And for other customers, it might be trading down to get, a ground protein.
Right. Love it. Great color in terms of what's going on, and also great to hear about some of the sustainability issues that I know is so part of the company. Whole Foods Market CEO Jason Beekle joining us back there at Bloomberg headquarters in New York City.
Here at the Plaza Hotel, though, we're going to broaden out from thinking about what consumers are doing, thinking more broadly about the global economy as well. We're also looking ahead to the Global Business Forum that's happening here later, starting in just under an hour's time, where we're going to be hearing from President Joe Biden speaking here a little bit later too. But now we want to turn to some of those broader trends in the economy. We've got the Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund, Kristalina Georgieva, with us here in the studio and with us in the Plaza Hotel. Kristalina, great to see you.
Welcome. Great to be with you.
We're here focused very much on climate solutions, on the challenges that the climate crisis has presented us as well. But I want to ask you about the situation facing the global economy. The Fed has cut interest rates. It's joined the easing party that global central banks have been taking in the past couple of months. We're about a month away from the update of the next IMF global economic forecast. What's your reading now on where we are in the global economy, how much those central bank rate cuts are going to help?
Well, the global economy has been remarkably resilient despite the horrendous shocks of the last years, despite of interest rates fighting inflation for the last more than a year. We have seen global growth holding. We project 3.2% this year, 3.2% next year. The two engines of this performance, U.S. economy and most of emerging Asia, especially India, ASEAN. We are now seeing interest rates in most economies going down, and rightly so, because we also see the price being paid for interest rates being high. It is affecting somewhat prospects for growth in major economies. Two very important points for your audience. Number one, yes, growth is holding, but by historic standards, it is not high enough to retain good prospects for our economies. Before the pandemic, average growth, 3.8%. Two, we also have very high debt levels. And that combination of slow growth and high debt is something that we at the fund worry about. What we want to see is countries taking seriously the importance of fiscal prudence. So the central banks have done their job. They fought inflation. Inflation is going down. Rates are going down. We need the fiscal side to be equally committed. And of course, we want to see more attention as to what drives growth up.
I want to go back to inflation, though. With the Fed finally making that big move last week, that half a point cut, inflation defeated, mission accomplished, done? Or would you say not necessarily yet?
Watch it. Yes, we are in a very good place. We have been predicting soft landing. We would see inflation down and growth still remaining firmly in positive territory. This is where we are.
Right.
We know that in the services, inflation is still flaring a little bit more, so the Fed is going to watch it. But broadly, we think that the Fed got it right, and we would see how that evolves in the next meeting of the Fed. Not to exclude there could be more cuts. But again, why is the Fed successful? Because it is data-driven. So they would watch incoming data very carefully.
I take note that you're worried about the fiscal side, though. How big a risk is what you're hearing in the U.S. election campaign? That's going to have a huge impact on U.S. fiscal policy.
Look, I mean, let's first give credit where credit is due. The U.S. has helped the world economy to stay afloat in this very difficult time. So when we think about the response to the pandemic, the response to the war in Ukraine, the spike of energy and food prices, having the U.S. economy to perk in the way it did, a very good news for everybody. This being said, we have to all think of the beast that may be around the corner. What we learned in these last years is that we are in a more shock-prone world, and having fiscal space to act should that become necessary is the message we send to all our members.
Is that our number one risk, though, the fiscal position of the United States and other?
Well, I mean, the United States has the ability to fund itself in a fairly comfortable manner.
Right.
What we see in some other countries, they don't quite have that privilege. So the pressure for imminent action, of course, differs in different places. We have been saying that make sure that you are not pushing prices up by getting more money into the economy.
Too much stimulus.
Than the economy can handle. So be careful.
But you don't worry about with the U.S. Federal Bank in particular, that by that half a point cut, that they maybe are putting a little bit more stimulus when the economy seems to be doing well, right? There's growth.
Yeah, the economy is doing well.
The labor market's still
Some
okay.
of the signs you actually are reporting in your program that consumers seem to be saying, well, you're not as confident as we were before. Let's remember that when you have interest rates so high, that has impact. And it is the desired impact to bring inflation down and the accompanying not so desired impact on consumer and business confidence. So my message is the following. We have to all be very watchful of whether there is risk of inflation to flare up again. What is happening around the world? You know, we just saw in the Middle East spike of a war with the accompanying not big, but still visible impact on oil prices.
Right.
So we are not, I mean, as the movie would go, we are not in Kansas anymore. We're in a different world, more shock-prone, more unpredictable. Keep your powder dry. Don't use all of it at once.
One of the shocks that did upend the global economy was Russia's war in Ukraine, and the fund was criticised recently for planning to restart annual economic consultations with Russia. Whose idea was that?
Look, I mean, we do have an Articles of Agreement, and they say you have to have regular consultations. The Russian case is a very complex case. This is not your normal Article 4. So, as you know, we have said we need to see whether we have all the data, we need to see whether we are ready, and at this moment, we are not.
But does that damage the fund's reputation, having that sort of confusion around starting and then stopping?
I think that the fund has been incredibly strong over this period of time of shock upon shock upon shock. We have supplied liquidity to countries that need it. We boosted reserves for countries so they can go through these shocks. And I think our reputation speaks for itself by the fact that our membership is increasing. We just got our 191st member, the tiny country of Liechtenstein, joining us. Why? Because we are an anchor in a sea of trouble. So I would argue that when you look at the fund, you have a credible institution. We have come through. We help the world economy to steer through very difficult time. We will continue to do that.
But is it tricky considering the war and in terms of advising Russia, like how to survive through this when most of the developed world, as you know,
of course it is
think it is a horrible war?
My heart bleeds for the people in Ukraine that have been so harshly hit by Russia's war. I want to see the war ending for the sake of Ukraine and for the sake of the global economy. It was incredibly damaging to the whole world. When we think of this, is it possible to do Article 4 without enhancing Russia's capabilities? We have to sit back and think twice. And this is what we are doing right now.
How long will you wait before that issue?
And why are some of our members, I mean, this is our dilemma. Some of our members are saying, please, you're the only institution, not Russia, other members. They're saying, you're the only institution that can come up with some credible assessment. What is happening in Russia? So that is also something that is in the equation. But I'm telling you, this is not an adventure we would take ever lightly. And I care very deeply for the trust of my membership. We need to be there as an institution that holds strong in a world that has more trouble.
I want to ask you about Argentina, because you guys have put in, there was some complaints by the Argentinian president about the IMF negotiator. You put in a new negotiator, and we do wonder about, like, what does that signal to other countries when they're maybe not happy with negotiations or policies or the IMF?
So the answer is very simple. It is the negotiator himself who found the situation being complicated.
Yeah.
How do you negotiate with somebody who does not trust you at all? So it was that negotiator that looked into the situation in Argentina. Does Argentina need help from the fund? Yes. Do they need our advice? Yes. Well, let me send somebody who the president would listen to. And I can tell you that that was a mature judgment, and I stand by this judgment of my staffer. Great professional, Rodrigo Valdez. I admire him for the maturity he has shown in that environment.
And are you hopeful for improved relationships with Argentina as a result of that change? Will things proceed more smoothly with the IMF's relationship there?
Argentina faces very, very tough problems to solve. And I know that Argentina would only benefit of having the IMF analytically to stand by Argentina and financially to stand by Argentina.
Madam Director, I don't know if you realize it, but there's an election going on in the United States. And I am curious. You've got two candidates with radically different positions on a lot of different issues, whether it's trade, immigration, the U.S.'s position on the global stage. On economic policy, what's your advice for the next president of the United States?
Look, I mean, the elections in the United States, this is the choice of the American people. They make this choice. They have a president. And then this president sets up an agenda for the country. We are always there for our members to give them our best shot advice.
So are your members worried about the outcome of the U.S. election?
The whole of the membership is now faced in a world in which 60% of people are going to the polls.
Yeah.
You ask different countries, they have different worries. But there are also very amazing stories that I hope you would tell. I was with Professor Yunus of Bangladesh. Here is a country in which the youth of the country said, no more corruption. We want to turn a page. And for us, supporting this country to turn that page, to get a good growth and good prospects for their people, amazing.
So listening to the younger population, always important. Kristalina Georgieva, thank you so much. We so appreciate your time here. Managing Director, of course, of the International Monetary Fund. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much for joining us. We're going to turn next to some breaking news that we've had out of Washington to do with Visa, the U.S. Justice Department suing Visa over an antitrust matter. Let's get the latest from Sarah Forden, who joins us from New York, who leads our legal team there as well, joining us from Washington, excuse me, with the latest on that. Sarah, great to have you with us. What can you tell us about this case?
Yes, hi. So great to be with you. The Justice Department's Antitrust Division has filed a 71-page complaint in the federal court in New York, and it's alleging that Visa basically used illegal means to maintain a complete monopoly over the debit card market. The complaint talks about payments of hundreds of millions of dollars that it made to tech companies like Apple, Square, PayPal, to keep them out of the debit card market. And it also talks about how it forced merchants to route any debit transactions through Visa by threatening them with onerous fees if they didn't. So the Attorney General is going to be speaking at a press conference in Washington starting at 3 p.m. and is going to be outlining all the details of the case.
Is this a case, I always think about any of these kinds of cases tend to drag on for long. Is this something that's we're going to be talking about for some time? Or is it something that you think Visa will want to make go away? Because it sounds like it's certainly an important, it certainly, if the case is true in terms of how important these revenue streams are for this company.
Absolutely. This is a major case. It is the first big case under the Biden administration's stepped-up antitrust policy into the financial services sector. I could imagine that Visa would want to try to find opportunities to make it go away, to settle it. But our reporting on the current thinking at the Justice Department is they're not in a settling mood. They're more concerned about policing markets and putting an end to anti-competitive practices.
This is something that we knew that there had been investigations underway from the Justice Department for some time looking into Visa's business practices. Is this it, do we think, in terms of the action that will be taken from those investigations?
So this dates back to Visa's proposed merger with Plaid back in 2021. That was what initially drew the scrutiny, and it was through their review of that transaction that they started to gather evidence about these anti-competitive practices.
All right, we're going to leave it on that note. So appreciate it. The latest on Visa joining that, and something we'll continue, of course, to watch. That is Sarah Forden. She's Bloomberg News DC legal team leader with the latest on that. So continuing to watch that. We want to shift gears, a different part maybe of the financial world. It's not necessarily processing by debit cards, but we do want to talk a little bit about what's going on in the regulatory space when it comes to cryptocurrencies and much more. There was a recent IMF working paper that found that crypto mining could generate about 0.7% of global carbon dioxide emissions by 2027. We talk about crypto mining and the impact it has on the environment.
Yeah, indeed. And look, it's one of those key issues that we're thinking about as this sector in crypto has been the focus of so much attention. It's come up repeatedly in the presidential race this year as well. It's just one of the many issues that we want to get into with the chairman of the U.S. Commodity Futures Trading Commission, Rustine Benham. Russ, who joins us with us here in the Plaza Hotel. Russ, great to see you. Thanks so much for joining us. Look, we're talking about climate issues first, and this is why we're thinking about the impact of crypto, but also more broadly, this is an area that you have lots of tentacles in your regulatory position. Talk to us about the question of environmental impact when it comes to crypto. Where are we thinking about regulation around that? What sort of rules are needed? What does the CFTC have power over?
Well, before we even get to the climate impact of crypto and crypto mining, I think the larger question in the U.S. is the regulatory structure, or really the lack of one. I've advocated for almost 3 years now that there's a gap in regulation, and this is just a product of the way the U.S. regulatory system is set up. Multiple agencies, couple market regulators, banking regulators, and for better or for worse, we've seen a sustainability in the marketplace, sustained demand by customers, both retail and institutional, and really what we have to do is make sure that we regulate it properly so that customers are protected, market stability is there, market resiliency. If we can get there, and I think that would be my priority, then I think the conversations about climate impact, energy usage for mining are important to ask and answer, and I think those have been actually informed or don't really know the associated risks with crypto. And we have to put the guardrails around this industry. And those guardrails are the same guardrails that we put around equity markets, derivatives markets, fixed income markets, et cetera.
No different.
No different. But we have to think about, look, there are going to be differences on custody, cybersecurity. There are components of the financial asset, digital assets themselves that are very unique from securities or derivatives. There's no doubt about that. But if we think broadly from a principles-based standpoint, the market structure components that have been put in place for decades and have worked quite well for U.S. markets are the same ones we need to think about for digital assets, because there's a lot of questions about the sustainability of digital assets, but here we are, 2024, moving into 2025.
Post-FTX.
Post-FTX and other crises, Binance, a lot that we have brought on the enforcement side, and there is still, I don't know about insatiable demand, but there is still demand from retail and institutional, and they're looking for regulatory structure so that they can increase those flows.
How open is the industry to regulation? I mean, it's obviously a conversation that's ongoing, and you've outlined the complexity of how the different agencies work in this front as well. Are they engaging? Is this something that you're actually able to see productive results that won't end up in a risk of over-regulation?
Yeah, so this is really the tricky part of this, because I think, I argue this often, the US capital markets are the best in the world because of the regulatory structure we have, because of the legal structure we have, because of the accountability there is for bad actors and those who violate the law. So there are many actors, I can't speak for the entire crypto community, but there are many who have been very engaged with Washington, both in Congress and the executive branch, to see what kind of regulatory structure could work around digital assets. Will this benefit them? Most likely. I've said this publicly in the past. Again, to my point, US regulation is the reason, in part, why US capital markets are the strongest, deepest, and most liquid in the world. So they see a benefit to regulation. The word often thrown around is legitimacy. But again, I want to pull back to what my responsibilities are: protecting customers, protecting market resiliency, and in essence, sometimes financial stability. And as I continue to see this market ebb and flow and go through its sort of organic growth, I can't help but raise a red flag and say, look, we're seeing this market grow. We need to protect customers.
Russ, what would you say in terms of the powers that are necessary in order for any kind of regulation over crypto by the CFTC to really work?
Yeah, this is a unique part. Like, we have two market regulators, CFTC, SEC.
Right.
There is a question around some tokens. I've articulated and advocated that Bitcoin and Ether are commodities under existing law. Congress wants to change existing law. That's fine.
We still debate.
Sure. But look, we've brought a lot of enforcement cases, and we bring them through, the authority we have over commodity assets, which in many cases is Bitcoin and Ethereum. But ultimately, it's registration of exchanges. It's registration of broker-dealers. It's registration of custodians, clearinghouses, data repositories. The same, again, core components and core regulatory tools that we use. And with those registration requirements come ability to surveil markets, ability to collect data, and ability to examine market participants.
From what you're hearing from the election campaign, because we ask about it because it's coming up with alarming regularity, some would say, in how often it's mentioned. What are you hearing that sounds like a good idea, or that sounds like a bad idea in terms of where regulation should be going from here?
So look, we don't want to undermine existing law. We don't want to change existing protections that exist for markets like derivatives, like stocks and bonds. We want to apply what we've learned and what we have in terms of authority to regulate markets to crypto. And it's about engagement. It's about understanding what the technology is. It's understanding what new risks or new variations on existing regulatory tools we would have to apply. But I often go, and I've had conversations with lawmakers in both the Senate, the House. There have been a lot of really interesting efforts, and credit to those who have led the way in both the House and the Senate to draft bills to contemplate giving the CFTC the authority. It's a unique circumstance where the CFTC regulates commodity derivatives markets, but not the underlying market. So we have this gap in commodity cash markets or spot markets, and this is where we find ourselves with digital assets.
All right, so we're still trying to figure out digital assets.
Yeah.
Let me throw artificial intelligence into the mix, right? Increasingly, not new, finance community has been using it for a long time, right? I do wonder if you guys are planning what tools you need to have in place to kind of oversee that aspect of our world.
Yeah, it's an important question, and at this point, almost 9 or 10 months ago, we put out an advisory, a request for comment, a consultation document, and in my mind, the steps we needed to take as an agency was, one, information gathering, engagement, getting better and smarter ourselves so that we can think about what existing rules apply to AI and where there may be gaps in the space. So we're working through some of those comments. I'm hopefully going to come out with some form of advisory guidance in the near future, but it really is contingent on us being thoughtful about how AI has been used thus far and how it may be used in the future.
Are you talking to big tech about this?
Look, when we consult, we cast a very wide net. We want to learn from everyone, and that not only includes the individuals who are directly registered or participate in our markets, but it certainly is the tech companies who are building these AI platforms and models that are essentially being used by the financial institutions.
We're here, of course, talking about climate issues. The Global Business Forum, we're counting down to the start of it now in just over 30 minutes' time. The CFTC recently put out guidance on voluntary carbon credits. I'm curious about the voluntary nature of that and whether that's something that's going to be relevant and enforceable, given that that's the framing that we're given on this area.
Yeah, so not unlike crypto in some respects, we've seen voluntary carbon credit futures contracts listed over the past couple of years, derivatives. And once we have futures and derivatives listed on our registered exchanges, I use this phrase a lot, we have, as an agency, a vested interest in the health of the underlying market. And in this case, it's a voluntary carbon market. We want to make sure there's resilience and health and high integrity in that cash market so it's reflected in the markets we regulate. Ultimately, from a broad perspective, if we're going to transition and hit our 2050 targets, our 1.5 target, we're going to need voluntary carbon markets. We're not going to be able to wean ourselves off of coal and some fossil-based, carbon-based energy sources. So we're going to need a way to allocate capital, transition to the global south and other nations that need to transition to low carbon intensive energy sources.
20 seconds, election betting. I know you guys don't like it. You recently lost a court case. Very quickly, nothing you'll warm up to.
It's not about what I like or don't like. It's not about what the agency likes or doesn't like. It's about what the law says. And the law, in our view, says that election betting is against the law.
All right.
Russ Benham, thanks very much for joining us, CFTC Chair. More coming up in the next hour of Bloomberg Business Week. We're staying here on Bloomberg Radio, on Bloomberg Television. The close starts right now.
This is Bloomberg Business Week. Insight from the reporters and editors who bring you America's most trusted business magazine. Plus, global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Masser and Tim Stenevec on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, everybody, we are just about 1 hour away from the closing bell on Wall Street. I'm Carol Masser, along with Stephen Carroll. We're live at the Plaza, our continuing coverage of, yes, the Earthshot Innovation Prize, but also just getting underway is the Global Business Forum that is sponsored by Bloomberg. So again, the major issues that are impacting the world, public and private sectors.
Yeah, indeed. And look, we're going to be hearing from President Biden later as well, and we'll bring that to you live here on Bloomberg Radio and television, and of course on YouTube as well too. So we're counting down to that. But also still to come, we're going to be discussing in more detail some of these environmental issues, thinking about renewable energy, the goal set at the UN Climate Summit of trying to triple renewable energy by 2030. New research from BNEF telling us that that's going to cost $1 trillion a year to try and get there in time. These are the key goals we're going to be discussing. We've got Ben Bakewell, the CEO of the Global Wind Energy Council, joining us coming up, as well as other experts on renewable energy too.
Yeah, we're also going to talk about what's going on in Latin America and the Caribbean. We've got the Executive Vice President of the Inter-American Development Bank, so interesting to talk about what's going on there. And then we're going to get into a little bit of the elections, take a look at presidents, how they manage their own money.
Who was the best president at managing their money? Key question we want to know.
You're going to want to stick around for that. First up, though, let's get another check on the trade. Your top business stories. Let's head it back to Bloomberg headquarters in New York City and our own Charlie Powell.
All right, I thank you very much indeed. We move into the final hour of trading on this Tuesday here. 59 minutes to go until that closing bell clangs on Wall Street with the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ 100 index, Russell 2000, all in the green for now. We have got the Dow swinging between gains and losses. Any advance today for both the Dow and the S&P will be another record. Right to the numbers here with the S&P up 8, a gain there of 0.1%. Dow Industrials little changed on the day, up by 4 points. We've got NASDAQ up now by 80, a gain there of 0.4%. Stocks are drifting higher, erasing earlier losses amid a jump in NVIDIA. A swaps traders' conviction in deep interest rate cuts this year solidifies. 10-year at 3.73% with a 2-year 3.55%. Gold now up $28 the ounce, up 1.1%. And West Texas Intermediate crude oil up 1.8%, $71.61 a barrel. Visa shares are declining by 4.8%. The Justice Department is suing Visa, alleging the global payments giant illegally monopolized the debit card market in what the Biden administration's first major antitrust case in the financial services industry. Sarah Forden is Bloomberg's D.C. legal team leader. She was interviewed moments ago right here on Bloomberg Business Week.
This dates back to Visa's proposed merger with Plaid back in 2021. That was what initially drew the scrutiny, and it was through their review of that transaction that they started to gather evidence about these anti-competitive practices.
And again, Visa shares trading lower by 4.8%. Rival MasterCard also lower, down 2.3%. Recapping, S&P up 9, up 0.2%. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, thank you so much. Carol Massar along with Stephen Carroll live here at the Plaza, and we're talking about global economies, but we kind of gave a heads up on everybody that there might be some news out of China early Tuesday morning, and we definitely got that. More stimulus.
Yeah, I mean, look, this is a package that is going to be a broad package of monetary stimulus measures aimed at trying to revive the second largest economy. We've been talking about whether or not China can make that 5%, around 5% growth goal. The central bank announcing a range of steps today, and to get us some analysis of that, we have Tom Orlick, chief economist at Bloomberg Economics, joining us from our Washington, D.C. bureau for this as well. Tom, we talked about this with Enda Curran, the global economy reporter, yesterday on the show about what we should be thinking about in terms of what China did. Talk us through the measures that have been announced, and are they going to be the, for want of a better expression, big bazooka that China's economy might need?
You know, I'm not sure this is a bazooka. I think it's more a bunch of small arms fire at the same time. We've had a 20 basis point cut in the 7-day repo rate. That's China's main policy rate. A 50 basis point cut in the reserve requirement ratio. That frees up more funds for banks to lend. More support for the property market with mortgage rates coming down a bit. And perhaps this is the most striking part of the package, PBOC support for the stock market. So central bank promising to put a bit of a floor under stock prices. Now, all of these moves coming together, that's a significant and positive surprise for China's economy. But it's not a bazooka. It's not a magic bullet. The size of the overhang of unsold property remains vast. So this is a kind of an initial step towards changing sentiment, giving growth in the immediate future a bit of a boost. Perhaps there's more stimulus to come, but it doesn't get China out of its big structural stress.
That's what I kind of wonder, Tom. I think about how many conversations we've had with you over the last few years about helping China, right, and getting it out of, there's still growth, but it's certainly not the growth that we've seen in the past. I do wonder, is it just a matter of time to get China back to where it was? I think about the U.S.'s own, great financial crisis and the property market and how long that hung around here in the United States. Is it just a matter of time, or is it just the need for continuous stimulation to finally change the narrative and the economic story and market story for China?
Yeah, it's interesting, Carol. If we think about the China of, let's say, 2000, the early 2000s, and the China of today, there's just been a number of really significant changes. So if you go back to the early 2000s, the US and China were friends. The US was welcoming China into the world trade system. China was still in the middle of a demographic boom, young people coming into the labor market. And China's urbanization was continuing apace. Millions of people a year moving from the countryside to the cities and looking for somewhere to live. And now all of those dynamics have reversed. The US and China are not friends. The US is imposing tariffs and export controls on China. The demographic dividend has turned into a demographic bust with an aging population. And that urbanization story, which drove property demand, well, that's ended with massive overbuilding and huge oversupply. So if we think about the sort of the structural forces for China, looking a lot less positive today than they were 10 years ago, 20 years ago. Not to say everything's doom and gloom. There's certainly positive things happening in manufacturing, China doing really well on electric vehicles, sustainable energy, but the big kind of structural forces looking much more challenging.
What impact do these measures, coupled with the drip feed of smaller measures that we've had announced over recent months as well, mean for the growth goal? This around 5% growth target, there'd been a lot of doubt about it. Does what we heard today put us back on track for perhaps reaching that goal?
So the moves we've had announced today, they're not game changers for China's structural stresses, but they are pretty significant as short-term growth drivers. Lower interest rates, more bank lending, more support for the stock market. This is going to be positive for sentiment in China. We saw stocks roaring up in the Tuesday trading day in China. And we think it makes it much more likely that they're going to get to that 5% growth target for the year.
Well, certainly something we keep an eye on as the world's second biggest economy. You know, we certainly want to see what happens next with China. Although I do think about, you know, propping up the equity markets once again reminds investors that sometimes the rules change when it comes to the Chinese government, whether it's industry or whether it's market. So it's something to keep in mind. Tom, as always, appreciate it. Tom Orlick, who's chief economist at Bloomberg Economics, joining us from our bureau in D.C.
We're going to return our focus to the climate stories that we've been talking about all day. Of course, us here live at the Plaza Hotel, the Global Business Forum, starting in about 20 minutes' time. We'll be back focusing on those innovations that can tackle some of the climate challenges the world is facing. Let's think, though, about some of the strategies and the goals that have been set already and where we are on our progress to meeting them. World leaders who are here for Climate Week are going to be under pressure to announce new strategies to try and meet one key goal, and that's tripling the global renewable energy capacity by 2030, a goal set at last year's UN Climate Summit in Dubai. The International Energy Agency among those warning that it's not unlikely to be met without major investment. And new research from Bloomberg NEF talking about it needing $1 trillion a year to try and reach that goal of tripling energy. It's a lot of money that's needed in this area. It's also an area that's seen huge growth as well. And we wanted to bring in David Cherney, who's clean energy policy leader at the global consultancy firm PA Consulting. He's with us from Denver, Colorado for more on this to get your expertise on this subject. Look, it's a big goal, right? 2030, tripling renewable energy capacity. Does it look achievable at all at this stage?
Stephen, it's a great question, and it is going to be quite challenging to triple renewable capacity globally. Certainly, I think everyone's going to give it their best shot. You know, here in the United States, we've had a tremendous amount of new clean energy come onto the grid over the last decade. You know, nearly over 100 gigawatts of wind, solar, and other clean energy technologies. So the ball's moving in the right direction. The question is how rapidly is it going to move down the field?
All right, so talk to us a little bit about initiatives in the United States. I've been out in the water, seen the windmills. I feel like wind energy, though we continue to see some pushback, and it is curious to see, you know, what the elections bring in terms of the White House come November and what that means for alternative energy policy. Let's maybe start there. In terms of the political environment, are you nervous about investments even in the U.S. slowing down specifically because of what might happen come November?
Certainly what comes November is going to have an impact on specific investments, right? So there will be winners and losers whenever we have policy change. And it's a really important point, but I think we need to think about the big arc as well. So if we look back over the last 20 years and we sort of use 2005 as the marker. So for the United States, that's when we had the largest amount of carbon emissions from fossil fuels across our economy. We've been declining on average about 1% a year across the economy pretty consistently from the Bush administration through to the Biden administration. So we've had pretty consistent declines. A big part of that has been the deployment of renewable energy. It's also been the downfall a bit of coal generation, as that is retired from the system. And so as we think about November and what's going to happen in the near term, so thinking about the next 4 years, really we're probably headed on the same trajectory, 1% decline per year. It's pretty hard for a presidential administration to cause a shift in what we see on a dime. It'll take some time for policies to play out.
But one of the big policies under this administration was the Inflation Reduction Act. Amounts of money never seen before being pumped into clean technology. Has that just not been effective enough?
Well, it's a good question, Stephen. And I do think it's actually been pretty effective. And the question is sort of, again, what are our expectations in the short term? And certainly extending tax credits for wind, solar, adding in storage to those types of tax credits. So production tax credits, investment tax credits is really helpful at moving the ball forward with wind, solar, storage, and technologies of the like. The Inflation Reduction Act, while it's named the Inflation Reduction Act, it certainly is one of the most important, if not the largest piece of energy and climate policy that the U.S. has seen in decades. And really, when I think about that policy, it's not just thinking about the near term, sort of changing things on the dime. It's a long term. It's going to be really challenging for us to meet the climate aspirations that we have set as a nation and, frankly, globally without innovation. So we're going to need new technologies besides wind and solar to get to where we want to go. And so the Inflation Reduction Act has created incentives for things like green hydrogen, carbon capture, storage technologies, offshore wind, advanced manufacturing, electric vehicles, and the like. And certainly we can't predict today, 10, 15, 20 years from now, what is going to be the technologies that are the winners. But we're planting a lot of seeds, both in terms of R&D, is also incentives to try to commercialize new technologies that can help us get to that last mile. And so really, both in terms of our power sector, as well as thinking about transportation, commercial, residential, it's innovations to come that the Inflation Reduction Act is really going to push forward. Certainly the near-term push is helpful, but anyone who had expectations that we were going to see a massive shift in a year and a half since the passage of that act, I think was misguided a bit from the start.
Hey, David, I do wonder, what moves the needle most when it comes to renewables and green energy? Is it the economic environment? Is it the cost of energy? Is it the cost of capital? Is it politics? What is it in your consultation and what you folks do in the United States and around the world? What really moves the needle in making changes towards renewables?
Carol, it's a fantastic question. The answer has changed over time, right? So if we were to go back 10, 15 years ago with renewables, thinking about wind and solar, certainly state-level mandates, targets, renewable portfolio standards for these technologies were really helpful in getting the ball rolling. Similarly, R&D dollars put forth both in private industry and by the federal government have helped innovation, bringing costs down. And I'd argue today it's about the economics at the end of the day. So while we've seen some increase in the near term in the installed capital costs of these technologies due to global challenges with supply chain that we've seen across industries, on the whole, we've had massive declines in the cost of modules, the cost declines in turbines, and the like. We've essentially been able to deploy more and more of these technologies as they become more and more cost competitive. And I think a good example, right, is to look at Texas, which has a renewable portfolio standard from more than a decade ago that was surpassed more than a decade ago, and we keep plowing in more and more solar and more wind into that market. And it's not driven by policy goals for specific amounts of these types of technologies. It's the economics. It's a cost-effective place to build those technologies, and the demand is there.
Right.
But which direction does the economics need to move in to make that process speed up? Is it that everything else has to get much more expensive so that people go to renewables, or is it that the cost of production for these technologies needs to come down?
So it's a mix. We are going to continue to see the growth of renewables, so wind and solar. But I think we all recognize that wind and solar only produce electricity if the wind's blowing or the sun's shining, right? So there's a bit of a tautology in that. And what we really need to maintain reliability in a cost-effective manner is dispatchable technologies that allow the system to balance itself. And so really this is where a lot of the innovation is needed, is clean technologies similar to nuclear that can provide baseload, clean energy, or cleaner dispatchable resources that can help balance the system. And so in the near term, a big part of that has been natural gas, and it's going to continue to be natural gas.
All right, we're going to leave it on that note. David Cherney, thank you so much. Clean energy policy leader at PA Consulting. They are a global consultancy firm joining us from Colorado. Coming up, we've got a treat, one of our own colleagues.
Someone who
She's been busy.
I followed her from London. Bloomberg's editor-at-large, Francine Lacqua, is going to be with us.
Are you a stalker? Is that what you're saying?
Don't we'll ask Fran that. We're going to be taking you through some of her big conversations she's been having here, including the new EU Climate Commissioner. That's next.
It's 3:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We have got stocks holding on to gains, buoyed by a jump in NVIDIA shares as traders largely shrug off a grim consumer confidence reading. NVIDIA shares, they are gaining today along with the rest of the market. Dow, S&P, NASDAQ all pushing higher. Right now, S&P is up 10, gain there of just about 0.2%. NVIDIA, by the way, up 3.9%. The Dow up 34, up 0.1%. And NASDAQ up 86, a gain of 0.5%. 10-year at 3.73% with a 2-year that's now yielding 3.54%. Spot gold up $30 the ounce, now up 1.1%. 26.58 West Texas Intermediate crude up 1.8%, 71.66 a barrel. American consumer confidence unexpectedly fell in September by the most in 3 years on concerns about the labor market and the outlook for the broader economy. Dana Peterson is chief economist at the Conference Board.
Definitely the headline dipped, and we're kind of at the bottom of the range that we've seen over the last 2 years. Much of it was because consumers are a little less optimistic when it comes to employment. Now, the overall net from jobs hard to get versus jobs easy to get is still positive, but it's come down a lot. And even for expectations, consumers are a little bit concerned about whether or not they're going to have easy job prospects going forward.
Dana Peterson of the Conference Board. The Justice Department is suing Visa over an antitrust matter, that according to a filing in federal court in Manhattan. Today, shares of Visa trading lower now by 5%, rival MasterCard down 2.2%. And an update involving Boeing and that strike. Boeing is now offering additional time to allow for a vote by IAM 751 and W24 members. That according to an email statement. We do have shares of Boeing trading lower now by about 0.7%. So again, recapping, stocks higher, S&P up 9, a gain of 0.2%. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Charlie Pellet, and that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, thank you so much. I'm Carol Masser, along with Stephen Carroll. He, of course, is host of Daybreak Europe. But we are here at the Plaza getting ready for the Bloomberg Global Business Forum, which is this incredible gathering of public-private leaders, the both sectors, and just tackling some of the big issues of our time. We've talked a lot about climate, but there's a lot going on.
Yeah, indeed. So you mentioned I'm normally based in Europe. I tracked down and chased around the Plaza Hotel earlier. One of our European colleagues convinced her to come and speak to us. Bloomberg editor at large, Francine Lacqua, is here. Fran, you're busy because you've been speaking to everyone at this event.
Everyone's here.
Every time I've turned around, you're kind of with another business or political leader, as it might turn out. So we wanted to check in with you to see how the sort of, I mean, what are the vibes you're picking up? Essentially, look, it's Climate Week in New York. We know this is a huge issue for policymakers, for business as well. We're waiting to hear from Joe Biden. It's the year of elections. Is climate still the big issue? Are people still active on this politically?
I think that's a very good question, and I think there's a bit of soul searching amongst the banks and people in finance and saying, what's the role of finance? Remember, they started this and saying, okay, we're the champions. We can sign conventions and lead the way. And now they say, well, we want to be enablers. So we really need to be the policy makers, that we need the presidents, the heads of state that are here to say, like, this is where we're going. And then the banks don't write the checks, but put the money together. And I think actually this shift in that the money's there, but the money may not necessarily lead the way. First you find the projects, first you find the policies in place, because there's been a lot of backwards and forwards, especially in this country with the election coming up.
Absolutely.
That the banks are saying, well, hold on, guys, we're here to enable, facilitate, but we're not going to be the drivers of this.
You've been covering this for a long time. We've been talking about kind of the green economy for a long time. Does it feel like a smarter evolution?
It does in certain pockets of the world. I think we're talking a lot more about the global south. And again, if you look at infrastructure, if you look at some of the things that need to change for the world economy to grow, if you green them now, then you're saving money. But if you green them now, it's also more expensive. So you need to look at the longer term. So again, you have a lot of multilateral, stakeholders, the World Bank, the IMF, the EBRD, people that can come in and help for these public partnerships that we've talked for a long time. But there are a lot of crises as well. So they say, look, let's focus on malnutrition, let's focus on health. And so I feel like climate change, people are doing it. They don't like talking about it so much like they did 2 years ago because of political backlash. But it's in the foreground, and the economy, I think, is changing. I think that we've reached a point where it's escape velocity, and we can't really go back.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the conversations that you had, the new EU Climate Commissioner, Wopke Hoekstra, as well, you were speaking to him earlier too. This is really interesting from that political point of view as well, because we had, if you look at the European Parliament elections in June, the Greens lost out hugely. They're not doing very well in the polls in Germany, where they're part of the governing coalition either. Wopke Hoekstra was somebody who was kind of went into this role because Frans Timmermans stepped out, so he was a relatively new face to the Commission. He's got an enlarged portfolio in the next Commission as well. He's got more powers. Is he optimistic that the Green Deal, the EU's, I suppose, sort of equivalent to the Inflation Reduction Act in some ways, its effort to try and decarbonise the economy, is that still as central in the conversation politically in Europe?
He is, but he's trying to shift the conversation so that it's not only about greening the economy, but actually it's tackling the cost of living crisis. And I feel from a lot of policymakers that some of these crises that we're trying to deal with, especially climate change, but it could be others, that you say, we fix the problem, and the problem is actually humanity, but it's not only about saving the planet, it's about inflation, it's about having access to clean energy or any energy because of the various wars also going out. And so he's trying to pivot and saying, look, we're going to be as tough as we have in the past. We need also carbon credits, we need a carbon market, but let's look at the lens through growth. Let's look at it through, some of the things that competition, some of the things that actually Europe needs, and not only as a kind of, oh, this is the Greens or an environmental project that you keep on the left side.
Is this pragmatic environmentalism we're getting from our politicians?
I mean, it is a little bit, but again, when you do a transition, you need money.
Right.
So you have,
That's
Mario Draghi had this report.
Yes.
This commissioner is extremely interesting because he was a Dutch finance minister. He was extremely frugal. So he was very close to austerity. And so I said, look, Mario Draghi needs 800 billion, let's think about 800 billion euros a year to fund this transition. Is the money there? Are we going to, this is more fiscal spending. And he says, look, again, there's money if we find the projects that make sense. So I think it's a more grown-up conversation, maybe, that the green transformation needs to be at every part of changing our economy. So this could be industrial policies, this could be some of the action plans that a lot of the new people in charge put in place.
But it is interesting with all the elections going on, and I think about it just here in the U.S. alone, like when you stack what's most important, people are concerned about still paying higher prices for things or just, getting by. So you do wonder where climate stacks up. All right, so you come to an event like this. Who do you want to talk to?
The heads of state, which are quite.
How's that going?
If anyone's available and would like
yes
to join
and no.
us, I will say.
My number is.
All right. So who you have talked to that you really?
A lot of chief executives, and I think some of them follow the heads of state, or they're the big people that usually are decision makers in the country. So we had a great conversation with, for example, Africa's richest man, Aliko Dangote. Now this is not an interview that he gives easily or very often, so it was interesting to hear his thoughts, for example, on fuel subsidies, how he's trying to change the Nigerian economy. You think about this economy, right? They're one of the largest producers of oil in the country, but they refine it elsewhere. So he built this refinery that's worth $20 billion to keep it at home. That means a new industrial plan. That means changing the way trade works, getting things in and out.
Right.
And so we also had a conversation on how does that change also some of the climate ambitions or some of the the green energy. So I think everything.
Does it make them less important? Like, how could it not?
Look, there's a lot of changes in Nigeria with the new government, and they've been putting so much subsidies on fuel that, again, if you're going to help with the cost of living, then the cost of gasoline needs to come down drastically if you're going to take these subsidies away. So again, I feel like it's a complicated conversation everywhere in the world.
But interesting to think about that, because we're here, the Earthshot Prize finalists were announced this morning at this event. You speak to the CEO of Earthshot. You also speaking to Jacinta Ardern, one of the trustees for the Earthshot Prize as well, because that's the sort of next step in this, right? And we talked about with Jennifer Sabasaja earlier about some of the great African companies being spotlighted in those finalists too. This is, I suppose, where you see it at the smaller scale, the opportunities that might be the big change.
Yeah, but it all boils to money. I feel like this is such a Bloomberg thing, but so
follow the money.
The prize, right? The prize is great because they're looking at technology, which is fine. But the prize is not, well done, you have the technology. The prize is like, okay, we need to now scale this because you can have the best technology in the world. If you don't put billions behind it so that it goes abroad, you can't fix any of the solutions. And so it's, again, follow the money. Is what we're trying to do here.
Right, exactly. I think we all always assumed that in terms of a greener economy, that the money would just follow because it made sense and that you'd see investment money, and it just hasn't always played out that way. And then you see some of these younger entrepreneurs or innovators who are struggling, right? With a really good idea.
It's tough to find money, and again, some of the money is going elsewhere. the money is going into infrastructure, it's going to private equity, it's going to
private credit.
This was the point Bill Winters was making to you earlier when you spoke to him, CEO of Standard Chartered, about the need for an acceptable return from climate investments as well. I mean, this is the kind of where the big names in finance are also looking for and demanding that too.
Yeah, especially when there's AI, that shiny new thing where you can make a lot of return. I mean, I had one huge fund manager who, off the record, so I can't say it, but he was saying, if I'd put my money in the big 7, I would have made 5 times as much as I have in the green transition. But it's not forever, and these things matter. So I think you have to not necessarily choose, but you have to understand the complex, which is very different to what it was 4 or 5 years ago.
Right, and certainly when the cost of capital is different too. I think you go back a few years, you could essentially throw money at anything, including ESG and greener initiatives, and they showed returns. It's not necessarily the case that way. Is there, I don't know, are you taking away a mood from the people that you're talking to? Like, are people upbeat about the outlook? I think we've got wars around the world. It's really tough geopolitically. You have a lot of people who are feeling that their governments don't represent them, that their economies don't represent them, and I'm just curious if you're getting a feel at all.
I think people are focused. I think people that are here to kind of learn, study, and do better. I know a lot of the politicians or the ministers are trying to speak to each other, also to try and understand some of the taxation policies that they've done in their country, what's worked, and if they can take that back, because this is the other problem, right? The last 3 years, governments around the world have spent so much money because of COVID that there's just, the purse string is so much smaller. So you have populations that are really quite upset about the cost of living crisis, that they don't feel represented. You have governments that are practically depleted. You have a huge debt. And so I think it's a reflection point. I don't know, they're not that pessimistic, they're not that optimistic. They're kind of rolling up the sleeves and saying, right, what can I do not to be kicked out of government? And what can I do to try and make it a little better?
Okay, Francine, thanks so much for stopping by.
You're not done, though. Don't you have more interviews?
Your busy schedule. More to do.
Maybe one or two.
Exactly. Our editor-at-large, Francine Lacqua, joining us here in the Plaza Hotel. And actually, if you want to hear that conversation with Bill Winters, it'll be the latest edition of the In the City podcast with David Merritt and Francine Lacqua, available to download wherever you get your podcasts. A must listen, I would argue. Always, every week from Fran.
She wants to say thank you.
Speechless.
Yeah.
Speechless.
I'm afraid she's going to get me back for that later. Okay, Fran, thanks very much for being with us.
Thank you.
Coming up next on the programme, we're going to be delving more into the question of wind energy. This is something we've seen massive expansion about.
Absolutely.
We know it's a huge help in the renewable mix.
But it's having some sticky problems, if you will, when it comes to expansion, whether it's regulatory approval for land usage and so on. So we're going to dig into it. As you said, Ben Bankwell is involved in it. He is the CEO of the Global Wind Energy Council. It's international. So we'll see what is working around the globe, where there are problems, and what's the growth going forward. I'm Carol Massar along with Stephen Carroll, and this is Bloomberg Business Week.
It's 3:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long. Here at Bloomberg, we have got the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ 100 index, Russell 2000, all advancing. Minutes to go ahead of the close, 20 to be precise. Let's head over to the first word breaking news desk for today's afternoon call. Here he is, Bill Maloney.
And good afternoon, Charlie. U.S. stocks are in the green, but quiet right now, with the Dow currently up 17 points. S&Ps are higher by 9, and NASDAQ is up by 0.5%. The U.S. 10-year yield at 3.73%. Gold is higher by 30. Oil trading in the green, and Bitcoin, that's higher by 0.9%. Among the main 11 S&P sectors, leaders were materials and tech. Financials and utilities were under pressure. And leaders to the upside in the Dow, Caterpillar and Dow Inc., while Microsoft fell 1% and led to the downside. In the payment space, global payments fell 5.6% after giving 2026 and 2027 guidance. In other news, Alaska Air Group was cut to junk by Moody's, and CNBC reported that Anthropic's revenue is projected to be $1 billion in 2024. Wrapping things up, KB Home reports after the bell. Live from the first breaking news desk, I'm Bill Maloney. Charlie?
Okay, we thank you very much, Bill Maloney. And to hear live breaking news over your Bloomberg, type Squawk, SQUA, on your Bloomberg terminal. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, thank you so much. I'm Carol Master, along with Stephen Carroll. We're here at the Plaza in New York City. Of course, the Bloomberg Global Business Forum getting underway as we speak, and talking a lot about, as you know, about climate change and climate initiatives. Having said that, let's just throw out a couple of stats in terms of setting the stage when it comes to wind. The World Economic Forum says that last year, the global wind industry installed a record 117 gigawatts of new capacity. That's a 50% increase from the previous year. Countries across the globe are investing in both onshore and offshore wind capacities. China leading the pack, adding substantially new capacity annually. And of course, we know that's because they get a lot of support by the government, and they've got a very ambitious 5-year plan.
Yeah, this is all, we're thinking again about that 2030 deadline to triple renewables capacity, one of the key goals set at last year's UN Climate Summit. So to talk about the journey as to how we get there and how the industry is dealing with this, we've got Ben Bakewell with us here in the Plaza, CEO of the Global Wind Energy Council, an international organization dedicated to promoting wind power as a key solution as we're thinking about renewables mix as well. Let's talk about where we are on the journey to wind power. We just talked through the great year of expanding capacity. Where does that get us on that goal that we're looking towards 2030, tripling renewables capacity?
Well, the good news is that we're going quite fast in terms of expanding. As you said, a record year, and we expect to break those records every single year going forward.
Yeah.
The bad news is that we're not on a trajectory to triple renewables. We're probably on a kind of doubling trajectory by 2030. So we go 117 last year. We think we're going to be at 130 this year, 148 next year. So it's building. But we probably need to be growing about maybe twice as fast to be on a net zero.
Why aren't we?
Well, there's a number of reasons. I think the main reason is that everything is just too slow. So planning around the world continues to be a barrier. I mean, it takes twice or 3 times as long to plan and permit an offshore wind farm than it does to actually build one. Mm-hmm. So in terms of the technology, the capacity to build, it's there. In terms of red tape and bureaucracy, we've got a long way to go. So that's probably number one. And then secondly, we're facing some market imbalances as well. I mean, there's been kind of race to the bottom pricing in some areas, which has then led to the projects not being profitable. We've had a bout of inflation. You've seen in the impact a year ago in the US. Some of the projects had to go back and renegotiate because of inflation. So there's some new kind of headwinds, but we're speeding up and we're going where we need to.
What about public money incentives and all of this as well? I mean, it's something that, we think about the Green Deal in the EU, Inflation Reduction Act here in the US. Are the public incentives actually doing the job they're supposed to in boosting expansion, or is it being undone by the obstacles that you're talking about?
So generally, we don't need subsidy financing for the projects, right? Because our levelized cost of energy is competitive with pretty much anything out there, especially vis-a-vis oil and gas fired projects and nuclear. So generally, we don't need subsidy. Having said that, there's places, especially in the global south and the emerging world, where they're just getting started, and where the initial projects will be more expensive than the projects in the mature markets, right? So if you think of somewhere, like the Philippines and Southeast Asia, I mean, they're starting from a virtual standing start. They've got to build the infrastructure, they've got to build the grid, they've got to build the ports. And so there's a kind of gap, I think, in financing for some of those emerging markets countries.
Where's the growth, onshore, offshore?
So onshore is still the biggest part of the market,
Yeah.
but offshore is growing faster. So the compound growth rate for offshore is faster. Onshore is still, 85% of the market. And what's interesting is that the onshore market is really picking up again with new countries. So Germany's really speeded up. The US, we're expecting to really speed up from this year onwards, right? So the IRA has had a transformative effect on the onshore market. It's taken a little bit longer than we thought, but we can really see now the construction starting, a huge amount of projects in construction. So from next year, we'll really start to see the US onshore market really take off. And then there's India speeding up as well. There's Australia's doing really well. And there's a bunch of new markets that are growing as well.
The red tape issues that you talk about, what is the message you're getting from policymakers on that? I'm sure this is something that you're engaging with them regularly on it. You were speaking to leaders here at your event here too. I'm keen to know how exactly that conversation is going. Is it coming back to people don't want wind farms near their homes? Is it much more complex than that? Is it a systems problem? Where's the roadblock?
I'd say it's mainly a systems problem, and there's been quite a lot of recognition around this problem for the last few years. I mean, we started at COP26 in Glasgow 3-4 years ago. We started really trying to put this on the agenda. It kind of sounds like a bit of a boring issue, and so it's kind of hard to get people's attention around it. It's about permitting after all. But it's pretty important. And what's happened since then is a number of countries are passing new regulation and new laws. For instance, in Germany, I mean, they've now made permitting offshore wind farms what they call overriding national interest. So that means that in the legal system, unless there's a very good reason to object, the project will be approved, right? So changes like that are good.
I wanted to ask you about a particular issue that came up in Europe this summer when we had such production coming out of particularly Spain and Norway that the price of power dropped below zero, which kind of sounds in some ways like a huge triumph, but doesn't make for a great business case. How do you sort of address that problem, which is down to storage, really?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a real problem, and I'm seeing it, as you are, in more and more markets at different times. And it's partly a function of having just a lot more variable power on the system, so a lot of solar and a lot of wind, which means that at certain times of day you've got a real abundance of power on the system. But it's ultimately down to two things. One is the market design, to make sure that the market design is kind of built around those new sources of energy. And secondly, it's about interconnectivity. So obviously the more connected you are, and this goes to Iberia, right, and Spain and Portugal, the more connected you are to the rest of Europe, the more the market will work in a balanced way, right? So we've got to work more on grid connectivity and connectivity generally around the system, right?
In the United States in particular, I spent a lot of time on the water, and for the first time saw, the turbines off of some of the islands in the United States. But I just do wonder, there is a pushback, it feels like, whether it's, Nantucket or Block Island or something, where people are pushing back on some of these. How does that perception change in the United States? How do we get there?
Yeah, I mean, I'd separate two things, maybe. So the first thing is people's genuine concern over the impact and the impact on nature,
environmental,
which as an industry we're very attuned to. And after all, most of us are here because we care about climate change and the environment, and so we want to do things in a way that's the best possible way possible. That offshore wind farms are nature positive and so on. So that's genuine, and I think the way to do that is to ensure the highest quality, the best standards of consultation, working with communities, and so on. Now, the other issue is disinformation, and organised disinformation, I think, is something that the renewables industry as a whole should be paying a lot more attention to, and civil society, journalists, editors should be paying a lot more attention to. I mean, we've seen organised disinformation around offshore wind, so the idea that offshore wind is somehow killing whales, even when there was no construction going on at that time, and organised disinformation with AI-generated images purporting to show marine wildlife has been harmed by offshore wind. That has then copied and pasted to places like Australia. It's been copied and pasted into places like Europe.
Right.
And that's disinformation.
That's another conference, the misinformation that's out there, like pick your industry, right? It makes it much more difficult. Ben, thank you, though, for finding time for us.
Thanks very much for having me.
Yeah, we appreciate Ben Bakewell, the CEO of the Global Wind Energy Council, right here at the Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Massar and Tim Stennebeck on Bloomberg Radio and Television.
All right, everybody, I'm Carol Massar along with Stephen Carroll. I didn't get your last name out before because the time
I know, but you
clock
got
was
so close.
I got Stephen in.
I know, we've got one Carol, we've got two Carols. We've moved on. Okay.
Host of Daybreak Europe in from London with us. And of course, we are covering the Global Business Forum put on by Bloomberg. And we'll get back to some of our conversations in just a moment. We've just got about 7 minutes left in today's trading session. And we are seeing markets just off their highs of this session, but little markets, or little changes, I should say. But we did see some of the big cap.
Yeah, big
names
move higher in
moving
NVIDIA,
higher.
which has been helping to move things. And actually, we're keeping an eye, too, on shares in Visa after the news of that Department of Justice antitrust investigation as well. Shares in Visa down around 5.4% as we move towards the close today. So that's one of the big decliners to be thinking about today as well.
Kind of an even split, I should say, when I look at the S&P 500. So it just feels like investors may be marking time. It was a big week last week with the Fed meeting, and that's something that we've talked a lot about in terms of interest rate policy. And it's not just what one central bank, although what the U.S. central bank does is certainly watched by all investors around the world, but you've got a lot of global central bankers, right, changing policy at this point, perhaps easing because of concerns about what's going on.
Yeah, and a little bit more of a sync now that we've had the Fed join the easing parties, where, of course, Bank of Japan being the outlier, pointing in another direction. But we did have some action from the Chinese central bank earlier on as well, taking a number of measures as part of a stimulus package there to try and boost what has been flagging growth in the Chinese economy too. And that, interestingly, was quite a big issue for markets, I think, earlier on going into the session, but we haven't haven't seen that sentiment play out as we've been moving throughout the day here in the US. Really, it is much more individual company news that's moving markets and not really moving them by very much, which I think is the way we're thinking about it.
No, I think it's interesting. I thought listening in this morning, I thought there was going to be more of a kick to the upside for the U.S. market. Certainly saw it in Asia overnight and then into Europe, but it definitely pulled back a little bit or fell. That impact didn't see so much. In the meantime, we've been talking a lot about the renewable energy world, and I do think, like, you go back a few years, and I think everyone thought, you know, just pour the money into it, all of it will come, and it's, I think, a little bit more nuanced. As we heard from Francine Lacroix about, you know, how leaders are looking at it. It's not just about throwing money, it's
they want to see return as well.
Exactly.
And like, this is also part of the shifting conversation around ESG and how people feel that they can, first of all, talk about that kind of investment and how it plays into the decisions they're making. I think the business case is really the conversation that we're having here, particularly if we look at some of the Earthshot candidates, the finalists we had announced for the Earthshot Prize earlier on this morning as well. Some of those individual business ideas, scalable, interesting, you know, that prize money, if some of those do end up being among the 5 winners, you know, getting access to that sort of funding, boosting ideas like things like refrigeration in rural Africa, something to be able to boost the food chain supply there, the use of trying to grow algae for omega-3 so we won't have to deplete fish stocks as much around the world as well. These are ideas coming from all over the world, and they're business ideas, and that's what makes the Earthshot Prize so interesting. And hearing from Jennifer Sabasaja earlier talking about some of those who won it before and the progress they've made too.
Well, I think what's also very interesting is it's, once again, you look at the emerging world as finding some of the solutions. We saw it, I feel like,
first affected, I think. Yeah.
Well, yeah, absolutely first affected, but I even think you go back to, like, financial innovation, you know, where it went, you know, it wasn't about credit cards or something, it was right to the phone and, you know, embracing the digital world because it just made more sense and it immediately kind of brought so many in the emerging world kind of back into the financial structure. And so I think about the same thing, that you're right, they are seeing it firsthand, and so looking for some solutions when it comes to climate change, just kind of thinking, we've got to do something, we've got to do it now.
And indeed, as we're counting down to the close of trading here as well, we're also looking ahead when we're going to be hearing from US President Joe Biden at the Global Business Forum in the next hour as well, listening to what he has to say about progress towards his climate goals. You know, there were big ambitions set at the start of his presidency. How does he feel about that legacy now? We're expecting to hear a little bit about the progress that he feels he's made during his term in office to this as we're counting down to the election.
Well, and, you know, he gave his final address to the UN today, earlier this morning, and talked a lot, not only about maybe climate change, but talked about the other issue that came up in some of our conversations, and that is artificial intelligence, and increasingly embracing our world in so many different aspects, but the regulatory component, what it means, and so we'll see whether or not he makes some of those comments a little bit later on. We're going to continue our coverage. We're going to get those closing numbers for you in just a moment. I'm Carol Master with Stephen Carroll. Our coverage from the Bloomberg Global Business Forum, it continues in just a moment.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters, I'm Charlie Pellet. We've got just under 2 minutes to go ahead of the closing bell. Stocks are holding on to gains. The Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ all advancing. S&P 500 index on track for its 41st record close of 2024. Stocks are holding on to gains, boosted by a jump in NVIDIA shares as traders largely shrug off a grim consumer confidence reading. Right now, we do have NVIDIA shares advancing, along with the Dow, the S&P, and the NASDAQ Composite Index. Right now, S&P is up 11 ahead of the close, up 0.2%. The Dow up 75, up by about 0.2%. NASDAQ up 85, gain there of 0.5%. NVIDIA shares up by 3.8%. Your 10-year yield, 3.72%, with a 2-year that's yielding 3.53%. Spot gold climbing higher by $34 the ounce to $26.62. Record there, by the way, up 1.3%. West Texas Intermediate crude up $1.16 a barrel, up by 1.6%. So it is an up day here. The benchmarks initially sold off after this morning's reading on the Conference Board's gauge of consumer sentiment. Callie Cox is Chief Market Strategist at Ritholtz Wealth Management.
Consumer confidence today was actually quite worrying. I just read the details, and we obviously saw a huge drop in confidence. For me, the worrying detail was the fact that we saw a drop in the evaluation of present conditions.
And again, heading into the closing bell, we got the S&P up 14, a record there, 57.33, a gain of 0.3%. Dow Industrials up by 0.3%. And NASDAQ up by 0.5%. There you have it, sound of the closing bell at the New York Stock Exchange as we wrap up trading on this Tuesday, September 24th. Boeing has given workers additional time to consider a revised contract offer after union officials blasted what they called an unrealistic and disrespectful proposal by the plane maker. Also, the U.S. Justice Department has filed an antitrust lawsuit against Visa, alleging that the financial services giant uses its size and dominance to stifle competition in the debit card market, costing consumers and businesses billions of dollars. And New York City Schools Chancellor David Banks is expected to resign. This according to Pix 11, citing sources that it did not name. The New York City school system is the largest in the nation. So again, recapping, we are looking at another record on Wall Street, 41st of the year, S&P up 14, a gain there of 0.2%. I'm Charlie Pellet. That's a Bloomberg Business Flash for on-demand news 24 hours a day. Subscribe to Bloomberg News now, wherever you get your podcasts.
This is Bloomberg Business Week. Insight from the reporters and editors who bring you America's most trusted business magazine. Plus, global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Masser and Tim Stenevec on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, everybody, we are continuing on Bloomberg Business Week on this Tuesday. I'm Carol Masser along with Stephen Carroll. We are live here at the Plaza. We're going to continue our coverage from the Bloomberg Global Business Forum in just a moment. In the meantime, we have a headline crossing the Bloomberg terminal. You know, it's interesting. We talked with the CFTC head earlier about crypto and regulatory environment. Touched a little bit briefly on FTX, but we do have a headline crossing. Caroline Ellison sentenced to 2 years in jail in the FTX case. She, if you remember, pled guilty to 7 felony counts of fraud and conspiracy in the wake of basically the undoing of Samuel Bankman-Fried and his FTX company, which really made everybody in the world, as we know, we covered it day to day, but just really rethink kind of what was going when it comes to digital assets and crypto in particular.
Yeah, indeed. There's a two-live blog running on the terminal as well with the details of the sentencing hearing. Caroline Ellison addressing the court, talking about how sorry she was as well, that she'd agreed to give up all the money that she gained from FTX, according to her lawyer, and that, according to her lawyer, she'll never profit in the future for her role in this crime as well. In her statement, she talks about apologizing to lenders, investors, victims who lost money as a result of her actions, and everyone, in her words, that she lied to in the process of the FTX issues. One interesting quote, the human brain's really bad at understanding big numbers, she said, and not a day goes by I don't think about all of the people that I hurt. So that is Caroline Ellison being sentenced in New York, described as being a cornerstone in the prosecution case against Sam Bankman-Fried. Prosecutors have asked the judge to spare Caroline Ellison from prison in that as well.
Yeah, she'll also have to forfeit about $11 billion as a result of this. So we're getting more details. She is sentenced to, as we said, the 24 months.
Yeah.
And talking about her cooperation specifically, the judge did say that she was by no means free of culpability. So again, something we covered from day to day for a long time, but just seeing certainly as a result some of the sentences.
And look, they'll also be looking more closely now at the sentencing of other cooperators in this case as well, Gary Wang and Nishad Singh as well. Perhaps this may indicate that they may also get jail time. We know if the prosecutors had asked her to spare from a prison sentence, but she is now being sentenced to 2 years at a minimum security facility as well. And the judge did praise Ellison profusely. He said that in this case, this serious, there cannot be a get out of jail free card. So we are talking about Caroline Ellison being sentenced over the collapse of FTX, and that hearing happening right now. We're just showing you some pictures of her leaving court, of course, during the trial, as we had been covering in detail, of the collapse of that company and the consequences it had been for Sam Bankman-Fried and for others.
Well, and we should remind everybody, right? She was the former CEO of Alameda Research, and that was the trading firm that was affiliated with FTX, specifically the cryptocurrency exchange Exchange, which was founded by Samuel Bankman-Fried, and then, of course, we know came to its undoing in 2022. So we're also talking about 2 years ago, or roughly 2 years ago, she pled guilty to fraud, money laundering, conspiracy charges related to her role specifically at Alameda Research. So again, we know FTX, Alameda, they all filed for bankruptcy, and it was really that case, that undoing. Here was an individual who was seen as the JP Morgan, if you will, of the crypto world, and so many people followed him, respected him. He was the go-to when it comes, or when it came to cryptocurrencies, and of course the undoing made everybody look very differently at the crypto world. And we think about what kind of oversight was necessary.
Indeed, and look, I mean, this issue for getting jail time is something that's going to keep coming back to as well, because the expectation had been that she wouldn't receive jail time. Our colleagues pointing to the fact that the judge made a comment that he couldn't remember when Caroline Ellison had been even slightly inconsistent in her testimony during this trial. Think about how that contrasts with sort of commentary that we heard around testimony from SBF as well, from Sam Bankman-Fried as well during his trial as well, which there had been frequent criticism from the judge of his inconsistencies in his testimony, and at one point that was something where there had to be extensive hearings without the presence of the jury because of the issues with the testimony from Sam Bankman-Fried, and the fact that there was such a big contrast in how the judge had described Caroline Ellison makes the sentencing here very noteworthy.
All right, just to rehash, Caroline Ellison sentenced to 24 months prison, ordered to forfeit $11 billion by a federal judge for her role in the FTX collapse, and this was despite helping prosecutors in the conviction of Sam Bankman-Fried, which of course was her former boss, but also her former boyfriend. So let's get to Bloomberg News, legal analyst and host of Bloomberg Law on Bloomberg Radio. June Grosso is with us back at New York headquarters for Bloomberg. So June, 2 years, first of all, fair sentence. Where was this in terms of what she was facing?
Well, it's very low compared to what she was facing. And, you know, the judge kept comparing her cooperation to what happened with Sam Bankman-Fried. He said he's never seen a cooperating witness like this. There wasn't any inconsistencies in her testimony, but that still she committed a crime here, and that, you know, there has to be some kind of punishment. You know, what's unusual is the probation department did not ask for any time, and the prosecutors didn't ask for any time. So the judge has to balance that and the fact that you want to encourage people to come forward, even if they're guilty, to later testify, and that she exposed this whole thing. So he brought that out a lot. But he still wanted to send a message that, you know, you can't get away with this. So he balanced that out. Now, Sam Bankman-Fried got 25 years. So compared to that, she only got 2 years. It seems, I would consider it pretty lenient, although there was a possibility that she would get no time.
What should we be thinking about then when we think about the other sentencing that we're still waiting for over the collapse of FTX? What could that mean then for their prospects?
Well, I think it probably means that they're going to get some kind of a minimal sentence. She was the star witness, and she was the one who came forward first and, you know, helped the prosecutors to unveil the conspiracy. And the judge even took out some spreadsheets that had helped the prosecutors in the case. So they will probably get probably a light sentence, but I don't know if it'll be as light as 2 years. So we'll have to see that. There are 2 more cooperators, but none of them. She was the star witness. It was obvious that she was the star witness. So I don't know if they're going to get as low a sentence as she did. And I say as low a sentence because, you know, she really was facing, you know, 10, 20 years if he had gone by the guidelines. So as Sam Bankman-Fried was sentenced to 25 years. And, you know, the judge took account of her cooperation, and the prosecutors also mentioned, it seemed like everybody was talking about the same thing, how she helped the prosecution so much by cooperating. But so that it was a little bit of a surprise because the judge was talking about her cooperation, et cetera. Then all of a sudden, bam. But, you know, he said, you did commit a crime. And then he said that you have to serve time for that. I had thought maybe he might even let her off without any sentence from the way he was going, but he was just laying a foundation, I think, so he could explain himself.
Hey, June, one last question. That $11 billion that she has to forfeit, how do we explain that, or what specifically does that denote?
It seems awfully high to me, and that's something that I was just talking to someone about. I have to go and look into it because it seems an awfully high number. I didn't think that she had gotten $11 billion from this, because I know some of the other cooperators who had, had homes and things. It was in the millions, not the billions. So that seems high. I really have to look into it. I think it's rather high. She has to, of course, she has to disgorge it. It's, you would expect that. The judge ruled it, but you would expect that if she didn't, the prosecution would come after her. That should go back to the victims. So that's not surprising, but the number is surprising to me, and I have to really look into where it came from.
Yeah, that number kind of struck me as well, and I know it was a red headline, certainly on the Bloomberg. All right, we're going to leave it on that note. Hey, June, thank you so much. Of course, our legal analyst here at Bloomberg News and host of Bloomberg Law on Bloomberg Radio, so be sure to catch her a little bit later on today on the latest, really, of the FTX saga.
Yeah, fascinating, that headline. Caroline Ellison sentenced for 2 years in her role of the collapse of FTX. Well, we are here at the Plaza Hotel in New York City today for the Global Business Forum underway. We've been looking at a panel discussion between the head of the IMF, the head of the World Bank, and also Mark Carney, former governor of the Bank of England, of course, speaking just upstairs from where we are here. We're waiting also to hear from the President Joe Biden a little bit later on as well. They're focused on global challenges around climate change, but we wanted to take a moment to talk about a different global challenge that we're thinking about as well, and this is on the health front.
Yeah, absolutely. When it comes to chronic disease, which is definitely increasing, we're seeing that in terms of our aging population. And when we think about this event, you think about economic costs, and health is certainly a big one. So back with us with some perspective on that is Elizabeth Stoddengart, Managing Board Member for the $60 billion market cap medical technology company. We're talking about Siemens Healthineers. She joins us. She is back in our Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio. Elizabeth, good to be talking with you again. So here we are talking about costs to the global economy, specifically chronic disease. Give us a little bit of context around that.
Chronic diseases are on the rise, and whether we like it or not, 3 out of 5 people eventually die of chronic diseases, and you can think of diseases like cardiovascular disease, so heart attack, stroke, cancer, or diabetes. So as we're fortunate to grow older and older as the society kind of progresses, there is some bad news which comes with the chronic disease, but fortunately there is also a lot of good news around the topic.
Elizabeth, this is interesting as well because, of course, so many countries are also facing an aging population and the pressures that's going to put on health systems as well. I mean, how prepared are health systems in major developed economies to be able to handle this sort of evolution of chronic disease?
I mean, we've been fortunate to see a lot of positive development over the past years. Just to give you a number, if you look at survival from people who suffer from cancer, this actually has improved by 33% since 1991. And there is a lot of opportunities now to catch things early, diagnose them early, and AI will also come to help us manage these diseases even better looking into the future.
You know, and I want to talk a little bit more about artificial intelligence, which I feel like on one hand is the cure-all, and it feels like that many tout to so much. Having said that, when it comes to healthcare, I feel like the GLP-1 new class of diet drugs has really been put out there as potentially already disrupting healthcare and the outlook for people when it comes to various diseases. How does that factor in, and how important is the accessibility of those types of drugs to the world at large into improving the health outlook?
Drugs like GLP-1 target the topic of obesity so that you just can address the risk of being overweight, which ultimately helps you improve in many dimensions when you look at your health, be it blood pressure, be it your risk to suffer from diabetes. So the availability of such a drug to the wider population definitely is very meaningful. At the same time, it's also not the solution. I think we will have to continue to focus on making sure we live healthy lives and that we focus on catching disease as early as we can so that we have all the choices of managing it in a good way.
When we're looking at how technological solutions can help us to both manage chronic diseases, but also, as you've been outlining, some of the things that, you know, we used to think about how heart problems were fatal for so many people, and that's something that's really evolved over time with the help of science and technology. Where is the investment needed? Which areas of research are kind of most fruitful for a company like yours to be involved in when it comes to addressing some of the issues these illnesses present?
Right, so we continue to invest continuously, and we're always looking for ways of making a diagnosis earlier, making the experience of the patient smoother, but also ensuring that we can be very specific so that we pick up the way disease which is very unique to a patient, and that we can help guide treatment, which then directs exactly to what you need and what will be most effective for you as an individual, and not do a one-size-fits-all type of approach.
Elizabeth, I do wonder about, you know, the customization of healthcare, something we've been talking about for years, how AI maybe finally makes that happen. I know cancer people say, you know, it's not the same. Obviously, every cancer case is different for people, even if it's, you know, the same type of cancer, right? And so treatments really need to be customized, personalized. How does AI get us there?
Well, AI provides this amazing opportunity of being able to really process and bring different data points together in new ways, and then make the recommendations and the insights very specific to you as an individual. And as the whole application of AI progresses, there will be more and more pieces of information we can bring together to then be very mindful and specific about which treatment may help you best. And maybe even you can think of or imagine that you create a digital twin of you as a patient, where you can even potentially test treatments before you actually bring it to the real patient.
But what's the cost of all this to health systems, to patients as well? I mean, this is going to be a factor, as we know budgets are squeezed in so many parts of the world. You know, when you're looking at new technologies that could be implemented, how much of a factor is cost? And is there investment there from the healthcare provider's point of view?
I think if you look especially at this last aspect we just spoke about, which is around making treatment personalized, it might be worthwhile to spend a bit of more money on making sure you pick the right treatment for you as a patient, over trying a one-size-fits-all, and then you may have a lot of kind of inaccuracies, and you may not benefit as much and get better as quickly as you could have based on personalized diseases. So I think there may be a real business case also in making treatments more individualized and really targeted towards you as the person you are.
And I am curious, just 30 seconds left here, Elizabeth. You know, we're talking about the global economy, we're talking about developing economy, we're talking about developed economy. But in the developing world and chronic disease, I mean, how do we make sure that we reach those people as well? And just got about 30 seconds here, just quickly.
So you're totally right that also in the low and middle income countries, these types of diseases like heart attack or stroke or cancer are on the rise. And here I believe one of the focus areas which can make a huge difference is try to implement mechanisms and look for ways of diagnosing the disease early. In these countries today, in many cases, we have a situation that cancer is caught very late, and when you catch cancer very late, treating it can be very expensive. So pulling forward kind of the moment where you know that you're in trouble can make a huge difference.
Got it. Elizabeth, thank you so much. Always appreciate it. Elizabeth Staudinger of Siemens Healthineers. This is Bloomberg.
It's 4:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg, and we begin with a number of developing stories. On a day when the U.S. stock market climbed to records, KB Home is reporting earnings per share for the third quarter that missed the average analyst estimate. KB reporting third quarter EPS of $2.04, the consensus $2.05. KB down after hours by roughly 5%. S&P up 14 to a record 5732, up by about 0.2%. 41st record of the year. The Dow up 83, up 0.2%. Nasdaq up 100, higher by 0.6%. 10-year at 3.73%, with the 2-year 3.53%. Gold surged $34 the ounce to $26.62, also a record, up 1.3%. And West Texas Intermediate crude rebounded by 1.5%, 71.44 for a barrel of WTI. Among some of the other stories breaking late in the day, Caroline Ellison has been sentenced to 24 months in prison and ordered to forfeit $11 billion by a federal judge for her role in the FTX collapse, despite helping prosecutors in the conviction of Sam Bankman-Fried, her former boss and boyfriend. The U.S. Justice Department has filed an antitrust lawsuit against Visa, alleging that the financial services giant uses its size and dominance to stifle competition in the debit card market. Today we had shares of Visa declining, Visa down by 5.5%. And Politico is now reporting that New York City Schools Chancellor David Banks is resigning amid a federal probe. So again, recapping, stocks climbed to a record, both the Dow and the S&P. S&P up 14, up 0.2%. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, thank you so much. I'm Carol Masser, along with Stephen Carroll, host of Daybreak Europe, usually in London, here in New York, which we've been delighted to have you here. And it just reminds us, right, like our scope is always global, because there's so many interconnected stories that are going on, and what happens in one economy impacts another. We know that even despite the pushback on globalization, it's really important to know what's going on around the world. And right now we're going to dig a little bit deeper into what's going on in Latin America and the Caribbean economies.
Yeah, because we're here at the Global Business Forum, Bloomberg's Global Business Forum, talking about some of those big economic challenges facing the world. So we wanted to focus on one particular region, in fact, and we've got Jordan Schwartz with us, Executive Vice President of the Inter-American Development Bank. You're based in Washington, D.C., an international development finance institution serving a whole range of countries across Latin America and the Caribbean. So we want to mine into your expertise. Thank you for being with us.
Welcome.
Thank you, Carol.
We're trying to paint a picture here of where different parts of the global economy are doing. We're very focused on central banks and the moves they're making. You know, the Fed affects everyone in the world, as we keep telling ourselves as well. Where are the economies that you're focused on now in terms of a post-COVID recovery? What's the outlook? What is 2024 looking like for them?
It's a great set of questions. The Latin American Caribbean region is very heterogeneous. Not surprising, right? We have the Caribbean islands, relatively small economies, generally single commodity dependent. In this case, the commodities often are tourism, if you will. And we have big complex economies like Mexico, Brazil, Colombia, Argentina. So it's a heterogeneous region, but it's a region that has been, I think, struggling to maintain and to increase its level of economic growth, of GDP growth over the years, to provide the kind of opportunities and services that the population has grown to expect. It's a middle-income region overall, but it still has vulnerability, important vulnerability. It has a few low-income countries, Haiti, for example, Honduras, and others, but it's generally a middle-income country. And I would say a theme of the day for us, a theme of the multilaterals that work in the region, particularly the Inter-American Development Bank, intermediating on the capital markets, trying to bring long-term financing for development, both public and private, into the region, is how to help the region take advantage of its comparative advantages, to leverage its comparative advantages. It's food production. For example, the region already produces probably 3 times as much as the food that it consumes itself. It produces energy. It has a very green matrix. It has a large hydro base. It has geothermal. It has all kinds of renewable resources. It can be part of the solution to the global energy transition, part of the solution to global food security. And to be able to see investment into those areas and the growth of those areas, I think will be part of helping the region return to a higher level of growth in the years ahead.
Jordan, what holds it back then? Is it the case that over the years, over the decades, because I feel like we've been talking about, let's take Latin America in particular, or even a nation like Haiti, gets caught in the policies of other countries. What is it that holds it back?
I would say...
and I hate to lump them all in one basket.
Yeah, that's a negative question. I have to find a way to make this positive.
No, I'm not trying to be negative. I'm trying to be smarter. How do we find a smarter way forward?
I think part of it is regional integration. So the economies of scale and scope that come with greater interregional trade, with the trade of energy, with the trade of goods, so that you can tease out the productivity, the competitive potential of the economies. It has overall been a region that has been somewhat atomized and hasn't brought together its own trading systems. That's probably part of it. I would say it's a vulnerable region. It's vulnerable to climate, to weather effects in general, particularly the Caribbean, Central America, but also increasingly, as we know, those commodity exporting countries that are suffering from drought, suffering from flooding, often suffering from flood and drought, increasingly at the same time in large weather events. So it's a vulnerable region. It has more to do in terms of bringing itself together. And I think probably there's a whole theme we could get into if we had another 6 minutes sometime to talk about competitiveness and the way in which the economies could encourage greater competitiveness.
We're very focused on climate here today. Obviously, we had the Earthshot Innovation Summit earlier on, the Global Business Forum happening as we speak. When you're looking at projects to support across the various countries that you work with, climate resilience, what are you looking at? What sort of projects are you involved in? Where are you seeing success?
It's a brilliant question. Listen, for us, we look sort of at two sets of challenges at the same time. One is the box, the asset, the investment. What can be done in order to better manage the risk associated with investment? What role can the financial intermediaries, the multilateral development banks, with long-term finance, with guarantees, with our own sort of toolbox for investment, what more can we do in that space? But then we also look at the systems and the utilities, the policies, the pricing, the quality of regulation, the ability of the utilities to offtake that investment, what needs to be done in order to make prices more self-sustaining, the financial sustainability of the utilities, the capacity of the transmission systems to offtake, to absorb all of this energy that's coming, and to deal with the intermittency of renewables. We are both a policy institution and an investment institution, and we're helping our client countries when we're dealing with both things at the same time. What goes into that investment and the environment in which the investment is being made.
Do you have all the financial instruments that you would like to be able to tackle some of the issues, especially when they're cross-border issues and you're dealing maybe with a couple different countries?
It's the cross-border issues oftentimes are not solely financial. It's about the integrity of contracts, about regulatory integrity, and the ability to trust and maintain the purchase back and forth or the trade back and forth of energy, as an example. The question about financial instruments is really interesting to me because we have been focused on financial innovation even as we are trying to assure the impact of the investments that we make, right? Because there's sort of two things. There's the instrumentalization. How do I spread out risk and manage risk better? What are the tools that I can use to do that? When do I deploy credit enhancements, guarantees, strengthening of offtake agreements, termination payments for power? But at the same time, what do I need to do to protect the consumer? What do I need to do to protect the natural capital of the investment in the environment of the investments? What role does multilateral have to make sure that whatever money we've mobilized can actually be paid back over time?
Right.
It's actually driving economic growth, the capacity of consumers and taxpayers to pay back all that finance.
And to encourage more future investment.
And to encourage more. I think that's an important point.
How much are you working with private investors to crowdfunding for projects as well? I'm wondering if we can gauge investor appetite in some of the projects that you've been supporting.
The IDB has a private sector wing called the IDB Invest, and it has an early equity and venture capital branch called IDB Lab. IDB Invest, which is we're the only multilateral with that kind of risk appetite, derived from an early investment wing. On the IDB Invest side, it is recently been recapitalized, which means that the governments that contribute to it from Latin America, the United States, Japan, Europe, have agreed to functionally double the size of the capital available in this world in which the whole concept of multilateralism is sort of being challenged.
Yeah.
We see a recognition that actually the private sector's got to be a major part of. So we have this vehicle, we have this institution, it's going to be doubling in size, and the balance of the IDB group is basically going to change so that it will be even slightly more than half private finance and the public sector side, the sovereign guaranteed side, growing as well.
I wonder as well in the MDB space, competition, right? You have the Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank, among others, who are also looking to invest in the same region as you as well. Is it a competitive environment? Are you all competing to kind of fund the same sort of projects?
It's interesting. We've seen this year a concerted effort and a lot of pressure from our own shareholders to bring the multilateral development banks closer together, to function as more as a group, as a unit, come up with platforms for investment. We're not competitive the way commercial banks need to compete with each other.
But can you work together? Do you have shared goals?
Finance, a large part of our financing is co-finance, particularly with the World Bank, which is very active in Latin America and the Caribbean, has sort of a similar set of protocols around environmental and social safeguards, transparency, procurement, competition, and the focus on rule of law. It's a somewhat similar culture, though we are unique in that 50.01% are owned by the borrowing countries, Latin America and the Caribbean. The United States has 30% ownership. This is how, in the Eisenhower administration, this institution was designed with this unique balance. And so we bring that to the table when we bring in other multilateral development banks, and of course, presence in every country. We're very decentralized, very client-focused institution.
We should talk about, certainly the global country involvement and the collaboration, if you will, geopolitics, or upcoming elections we see them all around the world, but certainly here in the United States as well, with someone who's very involved. How does that complicate what you guys are doing?
It's really interesting. We see ourselves not as a government, but as a stabilizing force, right? So when we're engaged, we're talking about the energy sector, but the same is true for the social sectors, for health, education. We spend decades working with these countries to develop their social protection systems, right? Their health and education systems, their power systems, and we bridge governments. Even when there's dramatic change in policies, we tend to help smooth the volatility of policy over time. That should be a function of a multilateral. We're there as partners for the growth. And even though the governments are our intermediaries, it's really the people of the country, it's the consumers and the taxpayers that we work for. And so I think we're used to seeing changes in political parties. We're meant to survive through those changes. And so hopefully we'll play that role going forward, Carol.
Can I ask you briefly about the US election and what risk that could present, given that the US is such a big contributor to your funding?
I just have about 20 seconds.
No, it's a question. We get on with our business, and we know and trust that consecutive administrations, as has happened in the past, support what we do and understand roughly what we do, and we hope to work with whoever comes in.
Jordan Schwartz, thank you so much. Executive VP, Inter-American Development Bank. Thank you so much for joining us here.
A pleasure. Thank you.
Pleasure is ours. This is Bloomberg.
4:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. Turned out to be another day of records on Wall Street. The Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ all advanced. Records on the S&P, a record for the Dow. S&P today up 14, now at 57.32, up by about 0.2%. The Dow up 83, higher by 0.2%. NASDAQ up 100, higher by about 0.6%. NVIDIA certainly adding to today's gains. NVIDIA shares up by almost 4%. 10-year 3.72, the 2-year yield 3.53%. Gold up 1.2%, higher by $31 the ounce right now. Spot gold $26.59, while West Texas Intermediate crude oil today up by just about 1.7%. WTI $71.55 for a barrel of West Texas Intermediate crude. So it was another update for the U.S. stock market. 41st record so far this year. Party on or party over? Emily Rowland is co-chief investment strategist at JH Investments.
We think about it like the music's getting turned up. At the end of every cycle, the music gets turned up as inflation comes down. The challenge is it gets really, really loud until you start to see initial jobless claims picking up and high-yield bond spreads widen, and then things change quickly. They go quiet very fast.
Emily Rowland of JH Investments. Briefly, Caroline Ellison sentenced to 24 months in prison, ordered to forfeit $11 billion by a federal judge for her role in the FTX collapse. And a senior executive for the cybersecurity firm CrowdStrike Holdings apologized at a congressional hearing today for that disastrous content update that crashed millions of computers back in July around the world. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, thank you so much. I'm Carol Master along with Stephen Carroll. We're here at the Bloomberg Global Business Forum at the Plaza waiting. President Biden expected to make some comments. He was at the UN.
General Assembly earlier, yeah.
Yep, talking about a lot of different issues. It was his last address to the UN as President of the United States. So it's a big day for him.
Yeah, it certainly is. And look, this is a chance also for him to address some of the issues around his legacy from his time in office and his long political career as well. So we're going to be bringing you that speech by President Joe Biden to the Global Business Forum here in the Plaza Hotel in New York as it happens in just a few minutes' time. But we're going to stay with the theme of presidents next.
We are, because who is in the White House, right? Sitting in the Oval Office, the Congress they get to work with. But that individual is determining policies, right, that are going to affect businesses in the United States, around the globe. They're going to impact certainly what we have in our wallets, whether or not we feel like the economy is better. And so we kind of started to think about, right, wanting to understand the individual who's in the White House, president, their own ability, right, to manage their own money.
Yeah.
What that might tell us maybe about them as individuals and what it means for policies.
So to discuss that, let's head back to the Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio in New York City. We've got Megan Gorman with us, founding partner of the independent wealth advisory firm based in San Francisco, Checkers Financial Management, the tax attorney. We want to talk to her about her book, All the President's Money, How the Men Who Governed America Governed Their Money. Megan, great to have you with us. Thanks so much for making the time.
Thanks for having me on,
What inspired you to
Stephen Carroll.
write this book? Because I wonder what the relationship is between, personal finances and mega finances when you're running a country. What inspired you?
Yeah, so first of all, I've always loved history, like a lot of Americans. And I think it's always interesting to understand where the presidents are a lot like us, where they have their humanity. And money is emotion, and this is a great way to look at presidents across American history in terms of how they feel about money, how they interacted with money, and what were their money values. Now, we are in an election year, so obviously, the spotlight goes to both Donald Trump and Kamala Harris to figure out, do their personal finances impact their policies? And I'd have to tell you, it's not that it impacts their policies directly, right? Fiscal policy is thousands of people working on it. But what I would tell you is it's a lot about sometimes a reflection of things that are important to them. So, for instance, with Trump and the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, he increased the unified credit, the amount we can pass free of tax at our death, to now in this year it's 13.6 million. Very much a reflection of his values of generational wealth transfer. In contrast, when we carve into the current tax proposals by Kamala Harris, very much a focus on the middle class. And she's been very clear to all of us that she comes from a middle class background. So there's some correlation there that we can definitely see.
What surprised you in doing this process? And I'm curious, did you go through all the presidents, or how did you pick and choose?
Yeah, I tried to. I got about 34 in the book, because the book sort of looks at the traits I see in my high net worth clients, right? And then tell you stories. So what I found really surprising is how quirky some of the presidents were. So I found letters that LBJ wrote that basically said, I was up at 2 a.m. in the morning, worried about money. And then in the next sentence, he starts talking about buying a suit that would be like somebody today buying a $4,000 suit. Things like, FDR forgetting to file his income tax returns because he lost the paperwork somewhere between Warm Springs and his house in New York. So really fun little things that made the presidents feel much more like we are today.
I love that you point out in the book the two questions that everyone asked you when you told them that you were writing it. Who was the best with money and who was the worst?
Exactly.
Let's start with who was the best.
Okay, so, the best people always means, is that the richest, right? And I think the thing is, wealth has a lot of connotations. So don't laugh, but I would tell you the best with money was probably Herbert Hoover. Grew up an orphan in Iowa, makes his way, and learns how to budget as a child in order to get access to funds to have clothing and food and medicine. Gets to Stanford, goes to Stanford basically tuition free because he was in the first class at Stanford University. And then he takes his geology degree, and through the use of grit and his budgeting, he ends up discovering gold mines in Australia. And so it's really important to note that as incredibly wealthy as he became, he was very, very charitable over the course of his life. I think the other president that we would call sort of the best with money is George Washington. And, over the course of his life, he built immense wealth through, acquiring land and by doing something that a lot of other presidents did to make money, by marrying up. Martha Washington had a lot more money than George, and so it helped him with his net worth by marrying her. So I think the thing about both of them is they both worked really hard, really utilized the skills that they had to build wealth. The one caveat is, and we always have to keep this in mind, is Washington was a slaveholder. When it comes to the worst, I'll tell you, Thomas Jefferson, do not take money advice from him. He was incredibly illiquid, not good at budgeting, really just focused on living a fabulous life. I mean, you wanted to go to his dinner parties, but you did not want to be there when the bills came. And so he lived this very big life, didn't have the money, and I'll tell you, at the end of his life, the last letter he writes is this beautiful treatise on democracy. The second to last letter he writes in his life is to try to buy wine on credit because he just didn't have the money to pay for it. And so that's why Thomas Jefferson just struggled so much with managing his money. So be a Washington, not a Jefferson.
I think people might be surprised, too, that Abraham Lincoln was one of the wealthiest presidents of his era. Yeah. Walk us through that.
Yeah, so Lincoln grew up poor, made a ton of mistakes growing up, right? Would start businesses, they fail. But he finally gets to the point where he studies, he becomes a lawyer, and he does what Washington did. He married up. So Mary Todd was a wealthier woman than he was. So between his law career and Mary Todd's family, he does incredibly well. And when you go to Springfield, Illinois, what's striking is he has the best house in town. But Lincoln really made money when he became president because he rented out his house in Springfield, and every paycheck, he would save half of it and put it into treasury bonds and treasury notes that were paying 6% and 7% to finance the war. And so by the time he passed away, he had a net worth of $85,000. Doesn't sound like much to us today, but really it's about $2 million in today's money. But again, Lincoln's one of those ones, he did make some mistakes, died without an estate plan, and the family had to have the Chief Justice of the United States come in and administer the estate. So did some good stuff, but struggled with some other issues.
I want to bring us right back up to the present, though. We're waiting to hear from Joe Biden in the next few minutes here at the Bloomberg Global Business Forum at the Plaza Hotel in New York City. Megan, talk us through, I really enjoyed the story that you told in the book about Joe Biden and house hunting. Tell us about Joe Biden's relationship with property.
Yeah, well, first of all, we have to remember with Joe Biden, this is a guy who grew up with not a lot of money and early in his life had a very traumatic moment with his wife passing away. And so as a result, when you deal with trauma, you want to be sort of slowing down your thinking. But Joe Biden loves real estate, right? We all know he has the house in Rehoboth, but he fell in love with this very big house in Wilmington, Delaware. And it was a house that he should never have bought on a senator's salary. And it was an old DuPont estate, was falling apart, and he was able to buy the house, but he didn't have the cash flow to keep it up. So he would do crazy things like sell off pieces of the land or only fix up certain parts. And so this house was sort of like an episode of The Money Pit. And it was something he really, really loved, because he loved this idea of what the house represented, but he really just didn't have the liquidity. And I think this is something that's relatable to all Americans, right? We all struggle at times to have assets that we might not have the liquidity to manage. So Biden is not someone you really want to emulate. You want to look at him and go, gosh, really think through how you make financial decisions and what will happen 5, 10, 15 years from now based on that decision.
All right, well, we're staying with kind of current presidents or recent presidents. How about the Clintons? Take us to Bill and Hillary.
Yeah, Bill and Hillary Clinton, incredibly smart people, but early on in their lives, they had an opportunity to invest in something called Whitewater. And anybody over the age of 40 remembers Whitewater, right? So, but Whitewater started out pretty innocently. If I showed you a picture of Whitewater, it was pitched to them to be a retirement community that people would be able to build houses on. And it was beautiful. And when they were pitched this investment, they made a mistake that most people do because they're afraid of looking foolish. They didn't do due diligence. They didn't ask a lot of questions. And they basically got themselves into an investment where really, if you had dug into it, you would have realized this was also going to be a bit of a money pit. And you were going to have to keep adding money in because there was no septic, there was no electricity on this land. And so the Clintons made a series of mistakes with this. Now, what's nice is we still get their up till 2016, we could still see their financial disclosures. I think one of the nice things to say about them today is they've really become quite organized with their finances. You definitely see estate planning in place. There's an irrevocable life insurance trust on Bill Clinton. They tend to invest in index funds. So they eventually learn their lesson. But the takeaway with the Clintons is, really do due diligence. Ask a lot of questions about your investments before you put your money to work.
What did you learn from researching Donald Trump's finances?
That could be a whole book all itself. Look, I think the thing about Donald Trump is you're dealing with generational wealth transfer, right? He's generation 2. He inherited $400 million from generation 1. His goal is really to get the money down to generation 4 and 5. So when you have someone with that mindset and you have someone who is willing to take risk and really push the envelope, what you get is a lot of estate planning techniques that are technically correct. That the technique itself is something a lot of high net worth Americans use, but he takes it to such an extreme level that that's where you start to have challenges. I would also say with Donald Trump, he also reminds me of another New Yorker who was incredibly aggressive with real estate, and that was Martin Van Buren. And so Martin Van Buren was also someone who became an attorney, very poor background, becomes an attorney, and starts to learn how to navigate the real estate market so he can aggressively buy land from people. So I would tell you, Trump is someone you just have to watch because of their risk and the fact that they're willing to push the envelope.
I'm thinking about the role of women in the dowries and the importance in helping out some of these presidents. Our thanks to Megan Gorman. She's founding partner of the independent wealth advisory firm in San Francisco, Checkers Financial Management. Her book, All the President's Money, How the Men Who Governed America Governed Their Money. So interesting
With
tales
so much detail, and also to think about it in terms of lessons as well. A fascinating thought of what we can learn from how some of those presidents manage their money as well. Not only about them, but perhaps some lessons in the future as well. Borrowing money for wine.
You've done that? Is that what you're saying?
I will ask you for that money later.
It's really not going to happen. No, but it's really fascinating, right? And understanding who these individuals were, because I'm obviously revered, maybe, or not, as a president, but they were people,
also,
too, who had to manage their own money.
Sure, and look, we didn't get time to talk to talk about the Obamas either, but one of the points that Meghan makes in the book as well is that how much of their student debt they had to pay down while they were in the White House as well, and that's sort of the reality of perhaps some of the more recent presidents and those that may actually be arriving into the White House.
I've listened to
with
some
big
of their
debts.
audiobooks, too, and they just talk about, especially on the race to the White House or when he was initially starting out, like the amount of money, and it was tricky times and difficult. So it is fascinating. And then it just feels like through book deals sometimes later on, things can change your position in a big way. So we are here at the Bloomberg Global Business Forum. We've had some great conversations, a lot of it around climate change, but also about what's going on in the global economy. Some of the issues that we've been talking about a lot for the last couple of years, persisting, watching data, watching inflation, watching growth, and we'll see what happens.
And look, the theme in a lot of cases of the conversations we've been having, the head of the IMF, the head of the Inter-American Development Bank we were speaking to, it's cautious optimism, right?
Yeah.
There's
I think that's
optimism
fair.
about where the global economy is going. We're through the inflation crisis, but a couple of warning signals. That's going to stick with me, the warning about the fiscal situation from Kristalina Georgieva earlier, something to think about in the context of the presidential election as well.
Yeah, I think that's something here in America. I think about, go back years, and every conversation, every investment conversation had to deal with what the U.S. fiscal picture was like, the amount of debt, how does it service the debt, kind of went away for a while, but we went through a long, very protracted era of cheap money. Money cost us nothing, and that made debt servicing a lot easier, certainly for the U.S. government. Go through a couple of different crises. You have a lot of government spending here in the United States, but also certainly the COVID pandemic increased spending around the world, and now governments are looking at how do we deal with that.
And in a post-Inflation Reduction Act world, post the Green Deal in the European Union as well, that's money that has been spent to try and foster some of the solutions to the climate crisis, foster the innovation, crowd the private sector investment in that's needed as well. Again, it strikes me to go back to the conversation that our colleague Francine Lacqua was having with Bill Winters from Standard Chartered. There needs to be, there needs to be an accepted return on these investments as well. That's still the private sector view. They're interested, they want to support, but the business case is really central to the conversations that are being had here.
Absolutely, and it is interesting to see the numbers, especially when it comes to things like green energy and renewable energy, that we have seen tremendous growth. There are still issues, and there's a lot more to be done, but certainly interesting.
I'm Kaylee Lyons alongside Joe Matthew here in Washington as we await remarks from President Biden, who is set to speak any minute now at the Bloomberg Global Business Forum in New York. These are remarks, Joe, that will be specifically focused on climate and the green transition, clean energy goals, we understand. And of course, it follows his earlier speech at the United Nations General Assembly, the last one of its kind that he will give as president.
How about that? The 79th session of the UN General Assembly, which has snarled traffic in New York, but is a major moment for this president, winding things down, considering his legacy and trying to project forward here a bit. When it comes to climate policy, we're told this is being billed as a bit of a progress report that we'll hear from Joe Biden. Of course, we'll bring those remarks to you live right here on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Yeah, the White House has indicated in advance of these remarks that while he's going to be talking about climate and conservationism, he also is going to talk about how each of those goals also bring along progress in lower energy costs, jobs, and a healthier planet, obviously. So perhaps tying it back to the economy and the domestic impact
economy
too.
This week. Yeah, as we hear from both presidential candidates, Kaylee, on the early edition, we brought you remarks from Donald Trump outlining his economic policy proposals in a speech today in Savannah, Georgia. Tomorrow, it's going to be Kamala Harris's turn. She's going to Pittsburgh as these two campaigns try to contrast their economic policy proposals, knowing they have some overlap on things like no taxes on tips. We'll see how different things sound tomorrow.
Yeah, indeed we will. And of course, we're also expecting to hear more from Donald Trump himself tomorrow in North Carolina, where he will be speaking. So clearly, there's a lot in focus as we come to air this evening here in Washington, both on the campaign trail and, of course, what we're about to hear in New York from the incumbent president, who is no longer running in this race.
So let's get into it. We're joined right now by Bloomberg's Ian Marlowe and Michelle Jamrisco as we get things started on the Tuesday edition, the late edition of Balance of Power. Michelle, we'll start with you. It's great to see you as we consider the impact politically of Joe Biden's remarks earlier at the UN and what we're going to hear now. Geopolitics, you can't hide from, obviously, in this room of world leaders in New York, but it ties into particularly the story about China.